Number 10. Hold the mustard, please. World War I cannot be talked about without talking about the crazy advancements in technology. Seemingly, nations and empires were just itching to try them out on each other. Airplanes, tanks, blimps, machine guns, mostly fairly new and extremely lethal. However, the life of a World War I soldier cannot be talked about without talking about mustard gas or chemical weapons. In 1907, major world players agreed to ban chemical weapons from warfare. So you can understand the confusion by Allied soldiers on the Second Battle of Ypres when over 150 tons of chlorine gas were released. A terrible weapon that would cause trouble breathing, burns, and vomiting. It was so effective that the Allies immediately began working on their own chemical weapons and gas masks to prevent the effects of this supervillain level weapon. I think this quote by World War II General MacArthur sums it up. Whoever said the pen is mightier than the sword obviously never encountered automatic weapons. He's not wrong. He's not wrong. Number 9. All quiet on the Western Front. This is kind of obvious, but people die in war. In World War I, a lot of people died, and a lot of these young men and comrades in arms formed bonds with one another, only to have those friends and brothers be killed and taken away from each other. Over 2 million German soldiers would perish in the First World War, which later would have all kinds of disastrous effects on the country, especially with the rise of Evil Mustache Man. France also lost a similar amount of men. Trench warfare was brutal, and I'll get to that shortly. One of my favorite books and movies, actually, All Quiet on the Western Front, depicts a group of young German boys who are in this thing together, all while having a strong anti-war message, or at least questioning the legitimacy of the First World War. Just make sure when you're in the trenches, no one's handing you those fresh new boots. It's an omen. Number 8. 1-star review. It may come as a surprise to some of you, but living in the trenches on the Western Front wasn't a super fun time. We don't recommend it here at Bumblebee. If you're like me, then you love a good hearty meal. Like my mom always said, I'm a meat and potato kind of guy. That's just how it goes. A nice grilled rare steak, roasted garlic potatoes, and a freshly tossed crisp lettuce Caesar salad. Ooh, that sounds amazing. I'm kind of hungry now. And maybe a beer or two to wash it down. Just a classic meal for a classic guy that I really enjoy. Sadly for the boys in the trenches, this could not have been further from reality. Anyone in the military today with our modern technology will tell you how delicious MRE rations are. But for soldiers of the First World War, rations were limited. And as time went on, especially on the German side, where in 1918 rations were whittled down to turnip soup and turnip bread. Ugh. There were still beer rations. However, and if I'm going to be shot at, I still want a little ale to cure what ails me. You know what I'm saying? Go a long way. Number 7. Trench living. I know after a long day of work, most folks like to kick back and relax. A nice warm house, a cold beer, maybe the game's on. You come home to a family that loves you. The life of a soldier in World War I was more of the horrific variety. Basically, you live in a deep hole that stretches for miles and interconnects with tunnels and other trenches. It's freezing cold in the winter, blistering hot in the summer. Rain's right on top of you, and the mud. Oh, the mud is an issue. Bogged down in a muddy hole, wet freezing with other miserable men who are also wet and freezing. Just not a fun time for anyone involved. I love winter and a good rainstorm here and there, but the difference is I get to come out of the cold after a long day making snow angels or jumping in puddles. The impending doom and being soaking wet would damper anyone's mood. Number 6. Disease in a time of plague. While living in a trench for long periods of time may suck, there's other things besides spooky spiked helmeted Germans waiting to kill you. Bullets, bombs, and artillery are lethal, but you had a very high chance of dying from disease. A lot of these trenches became isolated from supply lines for multiple reasons, and sometimes could be a logistical nightmare, meaning supplies were oftentimes difficult to come by. But no amount of supply could fix the disgusting living conditions of the trenches. Soldiers claimed by the war would often just rot, as recovering fallen comrades was made difficult in trench warfare, making diseases very easy to catch. Besides influenza and typhoid, the most common sickness would be trench foot, or gangrene, where really the only thing to treat it is a trip to the medic's hut with a saw blade to amputate your foot, in which is a pain I cannot even begin to imagine. No thank you. You ever seen 127 Hours? It's kind of the same thing.
Number 5. Hastings. The Battle of Hastings was fought on October 14, 1066 between the Norman-French army of William Duke of Normandy and the English army under the Anglo-Saxon king Harold Godwinson. It took place approximately northwest of Hastings, which is present-day Sussex. A decisive yet Norman victory. The English army was almost all infantry and had few archers, whereas the French, were an even half and half. The Normans did this really funny tactic where they'd pretend to flee in panic and then turn around and flank their pursuers. It worked every time. Most of the blame for the defeat lies in the structure of the battle. William was a more experienced military leader. He liked structure. Basically, when Harold heard that William had landed in England, he rushed south instead of taking his time to build a strong and large army. The English played offense way too much and got broken to bits. Harold's death led to the retreat and defeat of the English army. William was crowned as king on Christmas Day 1066. Number 4. Bannockburn. King of the Scots Robert the Bruce versus King Edward II of England. June 23, 1314. The First War of Scottish Independence. The infamous battle between Scotland and England was one of the most important battles of the Middle Ages. The end of a bloody war for independence. Long story short, Scots were like, yeah, we're gonna stay here and just continue to roll our R's. The gruesome wooden wars were caused by the English invading Scotland in 1296. Basically, he was like, bow and say I'm king, or good night. Well, a young warrior, William Wallace, guardian of King of Scotland himself, didn't really like that idea too much, and instead decided to hold off the English forces and was knighted a hero of Scotland. Although the bloody battle wasn't the end, it was definitely the most significant. Unfortunately, like every hero back then, he was also someone's villain. William was captured, hanged, drawn, and quartered. The battles between Scotland and England ended in 1328, 14 years later, with Robert the Bruce securing Scotland's independence and adding like 34 more dialects to the UK. Freedom! Number 3. Agincourt. The Battle of Agincourt was an English victory in the 100 Years' War. It took place October 25, 1415 in northern France. The unexpected English victory against the numerically superior French army boosted English morale and prestige while simultaneously crippling France. King Henry V of England led his troops into battle against King Charles VI of France, although he wasn't actually there, because he was a little cuckoo at the time. Yeah, couldn't really be trusted on the field. Lots of knights and swords and stuff, you know? That's all I gotta say. This battle is notorious for archers. They won this war, hands down. The Battle of Agincourt is one of England's most celebrated victories to date. It's a history in itself, as it forms the backdrop to William Shakespeare's play, Henry V. Number 2. Orleans. And again, cut to part 2 of the same 100 Years' War thing. The Siege of Orleans, aka Battle of Orleans, was fought October 1428 to May 1429. Again, between France and England. Yeah, they hated each other. From 1428 to 1429, it was the French Royal Army's first major military victory to follow their crushing defeat at Agincourt years earlier. A true grudge match. A young woman mounted on a white horse like a Valkyrie riding into Valhalla. 17-year-old Joan of Arc, the medium knight hybrid, chosen by God to lead the French to victory. Why aren't there like 38 movies about her? Like really? Under the Treaty of Troyes of 1420, England's Henry V became regent of France. By his treaty, Henry married Catherine, the daughter of the current French king Charles VI, and would then succeed to the French throne, cancelling out the Dauphin of France, also Charles. Oh yeah, the old switcheroo, huh? That chessboard of crowns, I tell you, just everywhere. Months of battles under the divine Joan led France to victory. The Dauphin crowned as King Charles VII of France, the hero, here being Joan, of course, who was later tried as a witch and hanged. The whole hearing God in your head thing kind of freaked people out. And coming in the number 1 spot, Gettysburg. A little bit of a time gap, but it's one of the most prolific and bloody battles to ever happen on this planet. The American Civil War, North versus South. The Battle of Gettysburg, 1863, the town of Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. Union versus Confederate. Union Army led by General George Meade and Ulysses S. Grant defeated attacks by Confederate General Robert E. Lee's army, halting Lee's invasion to the north and retreat back down south. Yeah, just to throw some numbers at you here, about 650,000 Americans died due to this war. It's pretty disgusting, but necessary, as the North was reprimanding the South, ridding it, and standing up against its archaic and dehumanization ideologies. The two armies collided at Gettysburg 1863 as Lee and Meade took turns firing cannon after cannon at each other. Lee led his army on a torturous retreat back to Virginia after the loss, resulting between 45,000 and 60,000 soldiers from both armies perishing in just 3 days. The most costly in US history from battles. Safe to say Grant and Meade were the heroes, and Lee, well, definitely the villain. On November 19th, President Lincoln used the dedication ceremony for the Gettysburg National Cemetery to honor the fallen Union soldiers who gave their life fighting tirelessly for the freedoms of every American. Well, there you have it, folks. 10 times in history that people were beyond cruel to each other, but with that, sometimes comes a hero or two, and a ton of villains. History's dark, but sometimes you gotta stand up for what's right, you know?
Kicking off the list at number 10, A Day in the Life. So as soon as the sun came up, your life as a Civil War soldier began. You would train day in, day out, preparing for battle. It was important that each soldier knew their role to work together as a unit. Now, I would say that there's no time for fun and games, but they always made time to blow some steam off. In between drills, soldiers would do chores just like we do every day. They would cook meals, do laundry, clean gear, and make sure that everything is smooth. Passing the time was done by playing dominoes or poker. Reading was of course a popular way of passing the time as well, but it was a lot harder to get your hands on a book back then, especially when you're running around between marches and battles. So more often than not, soldiers would trade newspapers with their opponents. You would hear about the Christmas peace treaty, but this would happen as well. They would just trade papers. A soldier named Milton Barrett, stationed in the 18th Georgia Volunteers, wrote about this back in 1863. He said, "Our regiment had just come off picket. We stood close together and could talk to each other. Then when the officers were not present, we exchanged papers and bartered tobacco for coffee." They would do it when the officers weren't looking. That's the most intriguing part. They would manage this by using a small boat. Tricky, always a way. The first aerial photograph was back in 1860. James Wallace Black took this photo not by using drones or any bowling alley crazy technology we have today, but rather just a hot air balloon. This lovely landscape is the town of Boston, and you're looking at it from 2,000 feet. This was a long time before selfie sticks. Even longer before that, hot air balloons were being used in warfare. The first account of a hot air balloon being used in war was 1794, when the French Committee of Public Safety created the Corps d'Astrociers, which is a hot air balloon squad. They were used in the Battle of Charleroi and Fleurus, and then 70 years later they were used in the American Civil War. They were pretty large as well. They could fit around 5 guys, where smaller balloons like the Eagle and Excelsior only carried 1 soldier. Those were for stealth flights. That'd be pretty brave. Imagine seeing a hot air balloon coming over the horizon and it has soldiers shooting at you. That's incredible. I didn't hear about any of this growing up. They could reach up to 1,000 feet, so they definitely had a vantage point like no other, and they would communicate with soldiers on the ground using flag signals or of course telegraphs. The most successful balloon program in the Union was under the command of Thaddeus Lowe. He and Lincoln were allies, and Lowe actually sent a telegraph to Lincoln once describing the view of Washington from above. Call your friends more and describe your view to them. You might get a few things done. Number 8, bounty jumpers. Fewer than 150 Union soldiers were killed for desertion, and Lincoln was actually constantly writing letters and endorsements reducing soldier sentences from death to labor during the war. That's how bad it got. Deserters were a big problem for both the Confederate and Union armies, so it was punishable by death. After the Battle of Fredericksburg, the Union had 100 deserters roughly a day. That's a lot, every single day. The Union actually used peer pressure at one point just to keep soldiers from leaving. In 1863, the Union offered regiment perks if a certain percentage of original men were on for a following tour of duty. So soldiers inside were making others stay on board. How they did that, what they said, we don't know. Bounty jumpers were men who were paid to fill in the spot of newly drafted soldiers. So these guys would join for a few days and then desert them all over again and join a new post as the new substitute and get paid. And of course, some deserters were branded to avoid this problem. Number 7, daily diet. These soldiers were all around 25 years old. The minimum age to join, of course, was 18, but a lot of these guys who were that young would often lie about their age anyways on paper. So on paper, the average was 25 years. But these guys were kids, basically. They ate mostly crackers, and when I say crackers, I don't mean the salty work snacks that you have today. These were made of like flour and water and just salt called hardtack. They would eat berries, nuts, and fruits. Anything they could find is all they had. Most of these soldiers were close to starving to death. Number 6, soldiers protest. 1/3 of the Union soldiers were immigrants, and 1 in 10 were African American, and those soldiers actually refused their salaries for 18 months to protest being paid lower wages than white soldiers. When black soldiers were signing up in the Union Army in 1863, they were only getting $10 a month, while white soldiers were getting around $13 a month. Officers were getting $700 a month too. It was just insane. To make things even worse, black soldiers were then hit with a $3 monthly cleaning fee, bringing that down to $7 a month now. So a protest was in order and it was held for 18 months, and then come September 1864, black soldiers received equal pay that was retroactive to their enlistment date. So they finally were able to send money back to their families after that long.
Number 5, the Battle of Mogadishu. Here's a modern one for you. It was a simple job. Grab 2 high-value targets, known collaborators of a corrupt Somali leader who's basically just a dictator. Things were going great until 2 $6 million Black Hawk helicopters were downed by enemies on the ground. An in-and-out operation that was supposed to last no longer than an hour. Tops, I swear, I promise. It actually turned out to be an overnight 16-hour rescue op that saw 18 Americans lose their life, known as the Black Hawk Down situation, or operation I guess. So what's the lesson on this one? I'm not really sure, to be honest, but what I do know is that it left a mark on 90s history and American military snafus. Number 4, Castle Itter. Okay, good guys wear one outfit, bad guys wear another. If the soldier in front of you sounds German and it's World War II, then it's probably the enemy. Chances are. It all makes sense, right? Well, the Battle of Castle Itter makes no sense. When World War II was coming to its climactic close, Americans and Allied forces were coming from the west, and all of Mother Russia was coming from the east. A lot of Germans fought to the bitter end, but the smart ones knew it was time to jump ship. You can see it was falling apart. And in the case of Castle Itter, they actually joined forces with Americans and Allies to defend high-value prisoners from an SS detachment who still thought Germany could win. Spoiler alert, they could not win. It was over. And the joint force would see a victory. That's kind of cool. That's a cool story. Again, where's the movie of that? Where's the movie? Put me in the movie. Someone make me famous. Let's go. Hollywood directors, I'm talking to you. Number 3, Stirling Bridge. There was one time growing up I had a super important test to take at school. I don't remember what class it was, but I remember studying extra hard for it. I mean seriously, I opened the books and I hit them hard, brother. Harder than my little heart could desire. Studying my little heart out. It was really hard, correct? And now I'm thinking about it, it's probably math. Anyway, well, when I went to bed, I knew that I was going to be ready for that test. The trouble is, I woke up at 9:57. School started at 8:30. Not only did I miss the test, but when I retook it, I didn't do as well as I thought. Well, this is the case of the Battle of Stirling Bridge, except there wasn't really any awkward high school stuff going on. It was just more of a serious battle for independence. The very famous William Wallace and the Scottish were at odds with the English, as you'll find in history they do that. Well, that morning the British general slept in, and Wallace, seeing an opportunity, seized it, and seized the day and victory for Scotland. The lesson here? Set your alarm, folks. Don't miss the battle. Set your alarm. Number 2, Operation Cottage. Canada and the US have been friends for a very long time, and we will probably be friends for a very long time. We have apologized profusely for burning down the White House. We're sorry, eh? Didn't mean to do that, bud. I'm sorry there, guy. Sorry, friend. Jeez. However, did you know that in a classic World War II military snafu, Canadians and US soldiers fought each other? Kiska Island, Alaska. It had been occupied by a small group of Japanese forces, which is kind of a weird story on its own. How did that even happen? So we went to go kindly ask them to leave, as you do. Trouble is, when we got there, there were no Japanese, and in a very confusing battle after landing on 2 different points of the island, our 2 great nations fought each other where sadly lives were lost. It was rough. It was sad. It was like 30 Americans and like 4 Canadians. I don't know if we're just good shots or what. I don't know what it is, buddy. Number 1, Bull Run. The Civil War. It's the one that shaped America. Brother versus brother. And it's what your dad reads about in his spare time. I don't know, dads just do that. Bull Run is one of the most famous battles from the time. However, I don't want to focus on the battle itself, as I've nerded out too hard in history already today in this video. No! Why am I talking about this, and why is this in the number 1 spot? Well, that's because of spectators. Yes, that's right, spectators. Wealthy folks would often come to large battles like Bull Run on a decent vantage point out of the splash zone, literally, and view the ensuing horror that was the Civil War. And before you even ask, yes, they brought food and a picnic to enjoy the show. Maybe don't watch that. Just an idea next time. Yeah, oh well.
Kicking off the list at number 10, Goose Green Battle. Although the British were taking on large numbers of Argentinian soldiers, their unit, outnumbered, still came out on top. The Battle of Goose Green took place on May 28th and May 29th, 1982. It ended with over 900 Argentine soldiers surrendering. It was a rocky start to the operation, to say the least. Argentinian forces were ready when the British arrived. The main assault force was the 2nd Battalion Parachute Regiment, led by Lieutenant Colonel Herbert Jones, but BBC Radio straight up spoiled the surprise initially. At the time, they were broadcasting news as was happening, morning of the Goose Green attack. The Argentinian forces were tipped off, and then when the attack was finally underway come the morning of May 28th, Jones sadly lost his life heroically charging at the enemy post. The Argentinian garrison formally surrendered the following morning, and the late Herbert Jones received, as well as his successor of the battalion, Major Chris Keeble, they were both awarded medals. Jones received the Victoria Cross, while Keeble received the Distinguished Service Order. Two para were outnumbered and should have lost when comparing support, but they ended up taking down the entire Argentine garrison, more than twice their own size. Number 9. Bluff Cove. On June 8, 1982, British troop transport ships were attacked from the skies. Argentine air forces took the lives of 56 soldiers and wounding 150. British troops were in the middle of unloading when two waves of A-4 Skyhawks from Argentina's 5th Air Brigade attacked. The Skyhawks departed from Rio Gallegos Air Base, and originally 8 of them were on the way, but 3 had to turn back due to refueling issues. With warning signals not reaching Bluff Cove, around 2 p.m. local time, the first strike hit 2 ships, the RFA Tristram and the RFA Sir Galahad. At 4:50 p.m. local time, the second strike hit. This one sank an LSU from HMS Fearless. Number 8. The HMS Plymouth. Just because an explosive is a dud does not mean that it's not going to set everything ablaze. The HMS Plymouth is a Rothesay class frigate named of course after the English city, and it served the United Kingdom's Royal Navy from 1959 to 1988. This warship has since been decommissioned and opened to the public, but finally scrapped in 2014. The HMS Plymouth was one of the first Royal Navy ships to arrive in the South Atlantic once Argentine forces invaded the Falkland Islands. Plymouth, the Antrim, Brilliant, and Endurance all combined forces to recapture South Georgia on April 28th. This was Operation Parakeet. On June 8th, during the Bluff Cove air attack, Plymouth was hit from the skies, but the 4 explosions did not go off. They were all duds. One of them ended up hitting the flight deck, detonating a depth charge, and a fire broke out, but none of them really went off, you know what I'm saying? 5 men were injured on the Plymouth, but later on, in the wardroom of the ship, was where the surrender of the Argentine forces was signed by Lieutenant Commander Alfredo Astiz. So there's a lot of history in that one ship. Number 7. Battle of Mount Harriet. Taking place in the late hours of June 11, 1982, the Battle of Mount Harriet is one of the 3 main battles that took place during the Falklands War. And they happened all on the same night. I keep saying the dates also just to really drive that information into your head, but these operations went down roughly at the same exact time. The British had 42 Commando, Royal Marines, artillery support from a battery of 29 Commando Regiment, and Royal Artillery. British war correspondent John Witherow recalls the naval support at the Battle of Mount Harriet as blistering. Here's a quote from Witherow on the evening of June 11, 1982. "We were involved with one night attack on Mount Harriet when the Welsh's guards were coming up as backup. This involved marching for several hours on a very dark night through a minefield. Sporadic shell fire slowed our progress tremendously, and eventually we made a base out of Mount Harriet, which was coming under incredible fire from a frigate offshore. The whole mountain seemed to erupt in flame. It seemed impossible that anybody could survive an attack like that. And this went on for well over an hour, just shell after shell whistling over our heads and hitting the mountain. Eventually this was lifted and Marines went in. And to our amazement, there seemed to be an incredible amount of fighting going on. There was a lot of tracer fire. The whole night was being lit up by flares, which cast a dead, unrealistic pall over the whole scene." End quote. 26 soldiers were wounded, and both Corporal Lawrence G. Watts and Acting Corporal Jeremy Smith lost their lives in the Battle of Mount Harriet. Number 6. Mount Longdon. One of the most violent firefights of the Falklands War was the Battle of Mount Longdon. The night of June 11, 1982, many recall as one of the most horrifying. 23 members of the Parachute Regiment lost their lives, while 47 others were injured. Veteran James O'Connell was 22 years old at the time. He recalls being at death's door. "I had dressings covering my face to stop the blood, and I remember being loaded onto a stretcher. I heard one of the guys carrying me saying, 'This one's alive,' and the others say, 'Is he? Well, let's take him back then.' There was a makeshift mortuary, and I think I was being taken there to be placed with the dead." End quote. He was literally on his way. I can't imagine what that feels like in numerous ways. O'Connell was hit in the head and face. A bullet went through his nose and right eye, just went through his cheekbone entirely. And on top of that, they couldn't even get helicopters to Mount Longdon for 12 hours, so O'Connell, as well as many others injured, had to just wait it out. The British forces consisted of 3rd Battalion, artillery support from 29 Commando Regiment, Royal Artillery, Parachute Regiment 3 Para under Lieutenant Colonel Hugh Pike.
Number 5. The Bataan March. The Bataan March is very similar to the beep test. Or imagine track and field in school, except instead of teachers forcing you to compete in events not designed around your body type, thanks, you're a soldier and the Imperial Japanese Army is making you march miles in the brutal sun. And some people with no shoes on, who often get berated and tormented. Okay, I guess the two aren't very similar at all, but you get the point. All you need to know is that some POWs took a very long walk And a lot of these POWs, for sure, were not supposed to be treated that way. It was really bad, actually. Did not make it to the destination at all. MacArthur said he was coming back after this, and boy did he. Ooh, he came back with a vengeance. Number 4, veterans. This one is a broad stroke, but I think it fits the bill here. Pretty accurately, actually. This goes out to all veterans of the Second World War. Folks at home, you might have to show them this because I can imagine they're a little bit older and probably not too familiar with YouTube, but thank you to all the men and women out there who did their part and paid a bill that I know I never could. The closest I ever want to be to a battlefield is, well, Battlefield, or Call of Duty. From the campaigns in Africa, Italy, France, and pushing all the way into Germany, as well as the brave fighting in the Pacific. I remember, and I for one am very thankful. You don't need to tell me how hard it was to survive or the fight when you came back home. A little wholesome point there. I love that. You guys are great. Thank you very much. Number 3, Bob Hoover, the pilot's pilot. You gotta respect the style of Bob Hoover. Okay, so let's say you spend a year in a German POW camp. You make for your escape, except now what? If it's early 1940s like Bob Hoover found himself in, not a lot of Germanless areas to be in. Well, Bob Hoover knew he needed to say Auf Wiedersehen and get the heck out of there. Bob Hoover did not walk, however. No. He did something much cooler. Kind of like when you hijack your first Banshee in Halo 3. Yeah, same thing and same feeling. Bob, being the excellent pilot he was, managed to steal a German plane and flew back to safety, where he linked up with some British allies in the area. How James Bond of you, sir. Oh yes, I love it. Number 2, Ivan Chizhov. Another airplane story, but gosh darn, this one is really impressive. Ivan Chizhov was a Russian fighter pilot who was having some plane troubles. And by plane troubles, I mean it was going to crash. So yeah, not good. The man knew he had to eject, but the troublesome German planes around him, and the German planes being known for shooting at parachuters, well, he knew he had to make a 5-head play. He said, I'll just wait till I'm below the ensuing air battle, and then I'll pull my parachute. Well, sadly, he waited too long, and his chute didn't open. He fell 5,000 meters to the ground and lived. He lived. Poor Ivan did sustain some serious injuries, but like a miracle got the medical attention he needed and asked to join back in the fight only 3 months later. That's just kind of crazy. 5,000 meters and he lived? How? Number 1, German summer camp. I promise it's not going where you think it's going. The international community had an idea of what Germany was up to during the years before World War II, but no one really knew for sure. When Allies moved into occupied Europe, it was clear some people were gonna have some explaining to do, okay? You can't do this, guy. You can't do that, man. You can't do that. But you guys knew that. It was awful and it should never happen again. You guys know what I'm talking about. However, today the worst camp I want to talk about is their youth program. Mustache Man was trying to build a better Germany. If you started with the youngins, the camp was designed like many today to give young folks something to do, to educate them, keep them occupied, or in my mom's case, some peace and quiet during the summer. Well, at this camp it wasn't bonfires and swimming, it was all kinds of nasty things YouTube probably won't let me say, but what I can tell you is that it was a brainwashing effort to get everyone in support of their not so glorious leader.
Number 10, Marathon. The Battle of Marathon took place in 490 BC during the first Persian invasion of Greece. It was fought between the citizens of Athens and Plateau together as one force to defend against the Persian army commanded by Datis and Artasphyrnus. The battle was the culmination of the first attempt by Persia under King Darius I to subjugate Greece. The Greek army, the underdog in this, inflicted an embarrassing defeat on the many more Persians, marking a turning point in the Greco-Persian Wars. Roughly 25,000 Persians against 10,000 Greeks. I'm on Team Greece, because they're clearly the underdog here, and the victors. Also safe to say Greece's confidence skyrocketed after this victory. King Darius the Great and his army fled with their tails between their legs. This battle was a response to Athens and Greeks being done underneath Persian rule. Yeah, they're like, you know what, we're out, okay dude, we're done. So Darius the Great took great vengeance upon the Athenians, which didn't really work out so well for him. Number 9, Thermopylae. Cut to part 2 of the same series, the Battle of Thermopylae. This was fought 10 years later in 480 BC between the Persian Empire again, this time under Xerxes I, and now Sparta under Leonidas I. Yeah, they were still pissed and wanted some more hands, so they came back. Basically, Greece's Navy SEALs decided to jump in this time. And the Greco-Persian Wars continued. Only lasted about 3 days, actually. Yeah, those Spartans, they're good. We're familiar with this tale as old as time. 300 Spartans held off like 300,000 Persians. Yeah, little more this time. They were definitely not bluff, but neither was the 900 Spartans and rebels. There was one path in, which was Thermopylae, and the Spartans did not let them by. You shall not pass! And they didn't. If you haven't seen 300, watch it. It's an amazing movie. Number 8. The Third Servile War. No, not the Civil War, the Servile War. Oh. AKA the Gladiator War. I'm Spartacus. No, I'm Spartacus. Okay, yeah, we get the reference, but who really was this guy? Well, he was a Thracian gladiator who, along with 4 others, was the escaped slave leaders in the Third Servile War, a major slave uprising against the Roman Republic. The third, actually. Yeah, people were pissed at slave labor. They were done. At first there was about 70 men, then that grew to an aggressive 120,000 escaped, trained, pissed off gladiator slaves. Yeah, that's absolutely terrifying. The Roman Senate's growing alarm about the continued military successes of this growing army led to Rome's army of 8 legions under the leadership of Marcus Licinius Crassus. With help of Pompey, of course, the war ended in 71 BC when, after a long and bitter fight, the Roman legions absolutely crushed them. Yeah, sorry Spartacus. He's a hero though. This rebellion is just one example of oppressed people fighting for their freedom against the oppressors. The Third Servile War was the last of the Servile Wars, and Rome would not see another slave uprising of this type again, as the impact had changed Rome forever. Number 7. The Battle of Hydaspes. This battle was fought between Alexander the Great and King Porus in 326 BC. These guys scrapped hard. The fourth and the last battle in the conquest of Asia for Alex. Yeah, this one took a toll on him. It took place on the banks of the Hydaspes River in India, subcontinent modern-day Pakistan. The battle resulted in a Greek victory after the surrender of Porus. Scraping by, it seems. Yeah, after conquering the Persian Empire, Alexander got cocky and thought he could just waltz into northern India without a fight. The forces were pretty even, too. Alexander had more cavalry, but Porus had his secret weapons as well. 200 war elephants. That's the most badass thing I've ever heard. Imagine seeing a giant walking tank with tusks just chucking bodies and horses out into the sky. There's literally nothing more intimidating. No wonder Alexander barely won. When asked by Alexander how he wished to be treated, Porus said, as a king would treat another king. Impressed, Alex, now king, allowed him to retain some of Porus's land. He renamed 2 cities, however, one called Nicaea, Greek for victory, and one after his horse. Yeah, talk about salt in the wound, dude. Number 6. Cannae. The Battle of Cannae was a key move in the Second Punic War between the Roman Republic and Carthage, fought on August 2nd, 216 BC, near the ancient village of Cannae. The Carthaginians and their allies, led by our hero Hannibal, not Hannibal Lecter, just Hannibal. One name. Well, he surrounded and practically annihilated the superior Roman and Italian army. It's known as one of the greatest tactical feats in military history, equally one of the most embarrassing by the Romans. I mean, the Romans were good. Literally a walking tank with shields and spears. They were practically unbeatable. But they rushed into Cannae, and Hannibal flanked the shit out of them. Yeah, him and a stew of about 50,000 rebel towns and cities, trapping the Roman army inside the city, who were then annihilated. Only about 15,000 Romans. Not a huge loss, but back at home, they were starting to panic, and the Romans started doing anything and everything they could to rebuild an army. It's forever known as a legendary and almost defined feat.
Number 5. Helicopter War. Probably the most iconic iconography of the war is the Bell UH-1 Iroquois, or better known as the Huey. The Vietnam War was the first war to see extensive use of helicopters, and honestly, I'm not sure how Americans would have fought the war without them. One of the main reasons the Viet Cong were successful was because they knew the land, they knew the jungle, and used many tactics to their advantage. Oftentimes the jungle being their best weapon of defense itself. Even though chemicals and napalm were being used to help unjungle the jungle, it's the extensive use and effectiveness of the Huey helicopter that gave America the technological edge it so needed. For anyone that was actually there, I can just imagine the relief of soldiers that they must have felt when seeing those green beauties come barreling out of the sky. The helicopters turned out to be a great design and was used for many years after the Vietnam War. Number 4. Draft dodging. Grade 12, what a great time to be alive. You're about to graduate. All your friends are excited about spending one last summer together before everyone goes off to college. Maybe you'll spend some time down at the beach, go hang out at the mall, or maybe you'll find a summer fling at a summer party. Nice. And just as you were about to put those bell-bottom jeans on, your mom says you got a letter. Oh no. You just got drafted into the Vietnam War, and it looks like you'll be spending your summer looking for a guy named Charlie in the jungle. That's weird, I wonder where he is. This was a reality for many young Americans who found themselves looking at a piece of paper that either meant they could die in a jungle or be in trouble with the law. However, when option A and B suck, go for C. In this case, that was draft dodging. Americans who received the mandatory volunteer letter fled in decently large numbers to other countries so Uncle Sam couldn't have his way. Many ended up here in Canada. Number 3, Napalm Girl. I briefly touched on this in the last part, but Kim Fantee deserves a moment of her own. There's a picture that made it out of the Vietnam War known as Napalm Girl. Well, Kim is that girl. Again, we cannot show you the image due to its graphic nature, but it's basically screaming Vietnamese children running down the road after a napalm strike near their location. Unfortunately for Kim, she was an innocent victim of total war. Her clothes were burned off and her skin was severely damaged by napalm, leaving her with scars and reminders of a horrible past. Almost 50 years later, she's still around to tell the story, and how she used faith and forgiveness to forgive those that caused so much pain and destruction to her country and herself. The photograph of Kim is probably the most infamous image of the war, and maybe the 20th century, and is a part of the media coverage that helped inspire Americans to pull out of the war. Number 2. I don't think we're in Kansas anymore. Good old Tricky Dick had just become president, and he had a plan to end the war in Vietnam, but first, they had to invade Cambodia. Why Cambodia? Well, basically the Viet Cong had this genius idea of moving war goods, materials, and troops on the Ho Chi Minh Trail, but also moving through Cambodia, which at the time was neutral. The US just wasn't looking there at first. However, when it was realized it would be a tactical good decision to stop that from happening, for poor Tricky Dick, the invasion of Cambodia felt like he was furthering the war rather than trying to bring it to a close. To make matters worse, the Pentagon Papers were leaked, and it was discovered that America had increased involvement and not decreased. The people had had enough, and anti-war movements sparked across the country. It wasn't too long after this that they pulled out of Vietnam and Cambodia. Number 1, the music. A lot can be said about the Vietnam War, but if sitting through history classes and watching some old movies doesn't paint the picture, then sit down and have a listen to the music that was made during the conflict. A lot to do with counterculture at the time. Once the Vietnam War went into second gear, art began to have its take on the Far East conflict. Books, movies, plays, but nothing more reachable and mainstream as music. The Doors, Rolling Stones, Jimi Hendrix, and the classic CCR. If your thoughts of Vietnam don't feature Fortunate Son by CCR, is it really a thought about Vietnam? I say no. This is kind of disturbing, as when you compare to music one decade prior, it's completely different. Despite baby boomers causing havoc on minimum wage retail workers today, their music is pretty good and does a good job of depicting the emotions felt in such a grim situation. Yes, I love the music. I love the music of the American people. Number 10, Battle of LA. Remember the 1940s? Okay, well, maybe not. I mean, if you did, then you might not be watching this video, or you would need assistance from a strapping young grandson such as myself to help you with searching on the internet and whatnot. It's okay, I help the old people. That's what I do. Well, for the folks that didn't know, the world was at war, and passions were a little high. America, in a nutshell, said they weren't getting involved the second time around until Japan came, well, they kicked their sandcastle over. And by sandbox, I mean they made Pearl Harbor go boom. So naturally, a few months after the Pearl Harbor incident in February of 1942, the lovely west coast city of LA was put into shock and horror when unidentified flying objects appeared in the night sky. Air raid sirens blared and anti-aircraft artillery began to light up the night sky, as this was suspected to be a Japanese invasion. Well, it wasn't actually. It was actually a false alarm, so no need to panic, right? Maybe. Number 9, the chosen few. In the beginning of the Cold War, it was clear that the West had some spooky, scary communist enemies to deal with. And almost immediately after the world had sent Germany packing, the Soviet Union was acting up. And then China, and then Korea. Well, that was it. We had it. The West of America had enough of communism spreading. It was time to contain it. So American and UN forces went to Korea to have a discussion at the 38th parallel. One group of Marines at the Chosin Valley had a chewy perspective of the event. When this group of Marines at Chosin Valley radioed in for a supply drop, they used the code word Tootsie Rolls as it was a code for mortar shells that they so desperately needed. Well, apparently the radio operator didn't get the memo and had an actual crate of Halloween's second least favorite candy scent. Besides candy corn, no one likes that stuff. But being the Marines, they used it to their advantage. And after being chewed up and placed over holes and gaps, the chocolatey treat made for a great filler, especially after freezing in the freezing cold weather at Chosin Valley. Cool story. Number 8. Jenkins Ear. The best way to describe life in the New World in the 18th century is aggressive corporate negotiations. The New World was full of plantations, trade, and YouTube's least favorite S word. So, also, naturally, the British Empire and its Royal Majesty wanted a slice of the Caribbean action. Trouble is, the Spanish had been there longer, and at the time, their presence was much more powerful. Well, the British had the means to de-Spanify the area, and all they really needed was a reason, because, you know, that makes war more palatable, right? Sure. Well, that's when they were presented with Robert Jenkins, a man who had his ear cut off by a bunch of Spanish thugs who raided his ship years prior. Turns out this was enough causey belly to start a war and fight over an ear. Hence the name in English the war became the Battle of Jenkins Ear. That's so weird. That's so strange. Imagine a guy, right, he's got his ear lobbed off. Time to go, let's go. I guess that's the reason, sure. Well, how long ago did this happen? It was like 10 years ago. Right, good enough for us, get packing. Number 7, Charge It Creasy. The Charge It Creasy can be described as a Hail Mary, one final push, the last card. It's a 1v6 and search and destroy on high rise in Modern Warfare 2. Bottom of the 9th and bases are loaded. If Hollywood has taught us anything in life, it's that these events always work out for our hero. Well, sometimes real life isn't like Hollywood movies. Take John of Bohemia for instance, your classic 1300s guy, marrying his way into royalty, a warrior, a knight, except poor John was blind in one eye due to a medical condition. Poor John. Well, at the Battle of Creasy, his bravery was put on full display. John had his horses tethered to other knights, because he was blind, as they made their last effort dash into the enemy, or charge if you will. They didn't make it. It didn't work out. Kinda crazy, like, right, I'm blind and what I'm gonna do is, I'm gonna tie your horse to my horse, and we're gonna run straight at the enemy. Number 6, Napoleon in Moscow. During the Corsican Ogre's European tour, he let himself into Russia. More specifically, he made it all the way to Moscow. This was impressive for a couple of reasons. One, because he had defeated other European powers with really little effort, and he was about to defeat Russia. Finger quotes. About to defeat Russia. Back in the day, there was this notion that if you control the nation's capital, you win. Well, he had Moscow, but it was more of a Pyrrhic victory. Russia had enacted a military tactic called Scorched Earth, and it wouldn't be the last time they used it. Basically, back in the day, militaries relied heavily on the lands they took for resources, food, shelter, and supply lines. Well, you can't control that if there's no land to take. So Russia destroyed their land, food, fields, and really anything that would have been helpful along the way as they retreated. Also, the winters were very brutal and cold, and the French were not prepared. So mix that together and awkward. Number 5, welcome to the suck. Meet Roy Benavidez, a soldier with so much courage and bravery, I don't even have a joke for it. A man who, after being severely injured and told he was never going to walk again, walked out of the hospital 6 months later. He then joined the very tough and elite Green Berets, where he went on a mission and was stuck in hell for 6 hours. A group of Green Berets, including himself, had been pinned down by enemy fire, and it wasn't looking too good. Most of the group, unfortunately, was severely injured or simply just not living anymore. Roy himself had sustained bullet wounds and had been stabbed by an enemy bayonet. He eventually made it out barely alive, and when the doctors got to him, they said he wouldn't make it. So with his last breath of life, he spat in the doctor's face to show he was still somehow holding on. When you look at the full story, it's crazy. It's so messed up. I left a lot of the gruesome details out, but definitely check that one out. Number 4, Hideouts. Officials say the Vietnam War officially ended in 1975. officially. However, for many, there was much fighting to do. For black Americans, the civil rights movement may have changed things, but there was still a long way to go. Vietnam had a communist utopia to unite and build, and many people simply had to recover from the casualties of war, injuries both physical and mental. However, for one father and son duo, this fighting lasted decades, literally. Ho Van Tan ran into the jungle with his 1-year-old son in 1972 after his village was destroyed by American bombs in Operation Rolling Thunder. Fearful that it would be the end of him and his family, he hid from the war. He hid for 40 years and wouldn't come out of hiding until 2013, when he was in his 80s and his son was in his 40s. The men were frail, malnourished, and had severely rotten teeth. Can you imagine what it would be like to live without any technology for 40 years and then to come out of the jungle and find smartphones everywhere? It's just such a polarizing idea. Messed up, man, messed up. Number 3, high times in Vietnam, man. Peter Lemon was one of many soldiers in Vietnam whose efforts defending a US base with a machine gun and his bare hands earned him a Medal of Honor. Thing is, Peter Lemon wasn't a Yankee, he was a Canuck, born in Toronto. Becoming a Patriot American and joining the war was part of his dream for some reason. What's so messed up about Peter, you ask? It's not about being Canadian in the American Army and really just doing very well. We're cool, I promise. But rather, it's his illusions of him fighting the war that quickly deteriorated. If you were around in the 60s and 70s, you probably took part in a little thing called grass. To say it was everywhere was an understatement, but I mean, hey, these guys were at war. They needed a break. His defense of the US base, while under the influence of the devil's lettuce, is where this point is getting to. Number 2, save the trees, man. Like I've mentioned before, the jungles of Vietnam were just as much as an enemy for the US soldiers as the communists were. Agent Orange was used to help unjungle the jungle, but it wasn't instant working and it took a few days to really kick in. Bulldozers were sent in after to help remove the trees. This for the US wasn't fast enough and they needed a better answer. So it was time to militarize some serious logging equipment. A 97-ton tree crusher that made trees 50 feet tall crumble like saplings. However, the machine was prone to breaking down and did get stuck in the mud. And in case you didn't know, towing a 97-ton vehicle out of the mud while being fired upon is not easy. No thank you, I'll pass. Number 1, actually Apocalypse Now. Yes, the movie. Go watch the movie, the original, not the Redux. You can skip the Redux. While based on the book Heart of Darkness, the movie is based around the Vietnam War, but if you ask me, it does a better job of getting the themes across in a more digestible setting. You can take the movie in many different ways, but even at face value as a movie in the Vietnam War, it's insane. It does a great job of showing the horrors of war, the insanity, PTSD, hypocrisy, and the gore that was the Vietnam War. A war that would leave America slightly embarrassed, as this was a time of great change all over the world. Couldn't recommend it enough though, seriously, go watch it. The horror. Number 10, Japanese Holdouts. September 2nd, 1945, World War II had come to an end as the Japanese forces officially surrendered. Well, that's awesome, right? Time to go on vacation, honey. Say, those Pacific Islands look beautiful this time of year. Well, especially when we're not being shot at. They look a lot better then. Sounds great, right? I know. Well, I'd be careful where you go, as when night falls on the islands, you can never be too sure what lurks in the brush. That includes soldiers of the Japanese Empire still fighting World War II on their own terms. That's right, Japan went on the defensive after the Battle of Midway during World War II, occupying every island in the Pacific to slow down the Allies. Now, you mix in being dug into those islands for years with an unrelenting dedication to the Emperor, thank you very much, and you got yourself some soldiers who just won't quit. Years after World War II ended, a handful of dudes who would finally come to realize that it was all over finally surrendered. However, some soldiers stayed in hiding for up to almost 30 years. They thought they were fighting World War II for 30 years. That is insane. Number 9, Mad Jack Churchill. With the way Hollywood works, I'm more surprised this guy hasn't gotten a movie made about him. Seriously, look this guy up, you won't believe it. However, what I can say is I'm glad he was on our side, and I am very sure of that. Mad Jack Churchill was a British commando who was more known for his use of medieval tactics, well, because he liked to use a longbow and a broadsword for battle, which I can't even tell you how messed up that is. I can only imagine the fear in the Germans' eyes when a man cometh marching over a hill, playing Scotland the Brave, wielding a broadsword and charging at full speed. Jack was captured, escaped, captured again, and after he and some other POWs dug their way out of a prison, he then walked hundreds of miles to the Allies in Italy. That's just a crazy story. Where is that man's story? And coming over to playing Scotland the Brave, that's crazy, man. That's insane. I like that though. I like that song. That's a good song choice if I've ever heard that. Number 8, Desmond DOSS. Besides having a name that really sounds cool, Desmond is a man with a unique experience. When you think of war, it's guy with gun go boom, right? Makes sense, sure. Well, not according to Desmond. He walked into battle as a combat medic without a firearm. Yes, nothing to defend himself with. I know, he's crazy, right? I know. Crazy enough to earn himself the Medal of Honor, which usually isn't earned whilst you're still alive. Usually earned after you don't make it. His valor was proven in Okinawa and Hacksaw Ridge, good movie, go see it, where he helped carry injured men back from the line and literally saved their lives, all while under the threat of enemy attack and sharpshooters. Over his life-saving career, he would save up to 100 lives, and a few more. He even saved some enemy lives. A shining light in pure darkness. Number 7, Second Son. Tsutomu Yamaguchi is a very lucky man. Folks, after hearing about this one, I would go and buy a lottery ticket. Seriously, you may win after this. Pretty lucky. Okay, so Mr. Yamaguchi was on a business trip in Hiroshima on August 6th, 1945. He was set to return to his home in Nagasaki when an American B-52 bomber dropped its payload on the city. And this was the big bad one. Miraculously, Mr. Yamaguchi, after being blown off his feet and receiving cuts and radiation burns, was still alive. He rested at a shelter and then returned home. On August 9th, he was explaining what had happened to him 3 days prior when another large flash of light and explosion went off. This was the other big one. It left him deaf in one ear, but he was further away from ground zero the second time. But yes, this is a man who survived both atomic devices. He lived all the way up until his 90s. Very impressive. Number 6, escaping to South America. This is one of the reasons I have an issue with the Disney Star Wars movies. Hang in there, trust me. After Darth Vader destroys the Sith with the love of his son and the Emperor takes a dive into the exploding Death Star 2 reactor, oh no, not another dive in the reactor, most people think it's all over. But what about the countless other Imperials, thousands of stormtroopers and Star Destroyers? For the Disney movie, they pretty much just updated the look and said, yeah, they're back. They're back now. But I need more details, baby. Speaking of details, how did high-ranking Germans escape to South America after World War II ended? Yes, thought-provoking, isn't it? Well, that's right, they did. The answer, though, is a network of rat lines. Germany 1945 had an issue. If you look to your left, there was a coalition force of armies coming their way, singing Yankee Doodle Dandy all the way to Berlin. On their right was an army bent on revenge, singing a much more heinous version of Yankee Doodle Dandy all the way to Berlin. So the Germans grabbed their schnitzel and sauerkraut to go and de-assed the area. Trouble is, the guys who were escaping were the worst of the worst. We weren't talking about any grandpas or opas here. These guys are pretty bad. One's responsible for very horrible things. Some were caught, but sadly, others were not. Josef Mengele comes to mind. Google him. Not nice. Number 5. Civil rights. If you know the 1960s, then you know it was a decade of change. A lot of history to unfold in just 10 years. Again, we could probably do a whole video on that. The Vietnam War is especially important towards the civil rights movement, as black Americans were a big part of the war effort in Vietnam. Black soldiers were nothing new to the American military, but their integration with white soldiers was. Every war previous, soldiers of different skin color were separated into different units. While most soldiers got along, there was still a long way to go, as black soldiers were still often mistreated. It seemed, however, that in a war zone, white Americans and black Americans were fine, but at home had tensions. We could do a whole video on civil rights and segregation, but to sum it up, racial relations made Americans ask questions. And for black Americans, the question is, how is someone expected to fight a war in a foreign country that we really have no business being in, for a country that won't allow a certain group of citizens to even buy a cup of coffee because they're not allowed to enter the building due to the color of their skin? Just doesn't make sense, man. Number 4. Mattel 16. The 1960s saw a lot of technological development. The extensive use of the helicopter comes to mind. During the early years of the Vietnam War, Americans were issued a brand new rifle. The M16 was a brand new design that flopped as hard as it could. as it tended not to work, which, if you're in a war, is kind of not what you want to happen. Your stuff's kind of gotta work. A rumor had spread around that the firearm never needed to be cleaned, which in a jungle setting with mud and rain just doesn't make any sense. This, with already existing flaws, made it jam and was rendered useless by soldiers. Nicknamed the Mattel 16 after the toy company, some soldiers were forced to use enemy weapons, which sadly in some cases may have led to fatal incidents of friendly fire. Number 3. I love the smell of napalm in the morning. Another very useful tool in destroying the Vietnamese jungle. Trees are made of wood, and wood burns, so set them ablaze. Except napalm is different. A chemical compound meant to burn at a very hot temperature of 5,000 degrees Fahrenheit, and it would burn for a while. This was used in multiple ways, but probably the most effective with airstrikes. While not the first time firebombing had been used, as it was proven effective in the firebombing of Japan during World War II, the Vietnam War saw almost the same amount of ordnance dropped, napalm and others included, as used in all of World War II by America. That is an insane statistic. It had a terrible effect on people as it can burn skin off. The most infamous picture from the Vietnam War had something to do with this. We can't show it to you, but you've probably honestly seen it already. The military would later disband its use, as the ability to control napalm's destructive power is limited. Number 2. GI Kebab. While the Viet Cong may not have won many battles against the US, they were still formidable fighters. They had the lay of the land and laid traps everywhere. From 1965 to 1970, 11% of American casualties were related to Viet Cong placed traps. What's so messed up in that is that in a modern war with modern technology, a lot of the traps the Viet Cong were using were something out of the Stone Age, but still deadly. Improvised explosives, swinging spiked balls, tripwires, single shot cartridges, and snake pits right out of Indiana Jones. I can't even believe that's real. But the most effective were punji pits, or punji sticks. A large hole is dug and bamboo spikes are placed at the bottom. Then, out of pure evil, urine or human excrement is put on the spikes. A thin layer of leaves or cover is placed on the trap, so when someone comes along they would fall in a pit of spikes, that if that didn't kill them, an infection from the waste would, or make recovery very, very miserable. That is cruel, man. That ain't right, man. That ain't right, Chief. Number 1. Apocalypse Now. Tiger Force was a long-range reconnaissance unit that later became known for its acts of war crimes. Not sure if there could be war crimes when everyone's doing naughty things, but okay. To quote Martin Sheen in Apocalypse Now, charging someone with murder around here is like handing out speeding tickets at the Indy 500. And like a scene right out of that movie, the members of Tiger Force had a tradition to make necklaces out of ears. I'm going to say that again. They made necklaces out of ears. There are a number of things Tiger Force committed that are honestly just not safe for life. But that's war at the end of the day. War is hell.
First up is how land scurvy was a literal thing, which I know evokes more like a piratey imagery, turning into scurvy knaves from all the liquor, no Sunny D, but that's the hang-up. You see, severe vitamin C deficiency, which causes scurvy, has no borders. Ain't no mountain high enough, valley low enough, river wide enough type of energy, baby. And no, it's not an easy fix. It's not, oh, just eat some oranges, my guy, here's some Five Alive. You and your fancy people knowledge of citrus. You gotta remember these guys ate like medieval folks. So, as author Andrew Holt explains, Crusaders greatly emphasized meat consumption only, and medieval knights generally equated meat eating with strength. Still no dudes with that ideology, have fun with that bulk loss, bro, but how bad did land scurvy get? Well, it killed 1/6 of the French army during the 5th Crusade. Written descriptions detail the agony of these crusaders, such as the 1218 siege, when men seized with violent pain in the feet and ankles, their gums became swollen and their teeth loose and useless, while their hips and shin bones turned black and putrefied. The peaceful death that followed sounded more like a mercy than loss. Scurvy proved overwhelming during the 7th Crusade as well, reducing the troops of Louis VI to bouts of pained howling as barbers sliced large pieces of flesh from the men's swollen gums. Next one lets me break out just a terrible Godfather impression. Ready? Ready? Today, on the day of my daughter's wed— I shouldn't have done it. Saladin, one of the most famous but most complicated figures of the crusading eras. A Kurdish leader, he was born around 1137 AD and was the first sultan of Syria and Egypt, fighting against the Christian Crusades. A skilled negotiator, manipulator, and brilliant mind, he was known for cruelty, but he could also be a noble and logical dude, and occasionally merciful and compassionate, as shown in the Siege of Kerak in 1183. While besieging the Crusaders' stronghold of Kerak 1183, Saladin reportedly ordered his army to avoid striking a particular area of the castle, because that is where future Queen Sibylla's younger half-sister Isabella was supposed to be having her wedding that night with her new husband. See, Crusade Queen Sibylla was famously married not to a European nobleman or a descendant of kings, but a landless, virtually unknown nincompoop, Guy Le Suigon, out of love, after a whole lot of public rejections and emotional BS and widowhood. But as hardcore as that story is, which trust me it is, I'm telling the one of her sister's equally wild wedding. So, as Saladin and his armies approach Karak Castle, Baldwin III, big bro of the bride and of Sibylla, say, let's take a quick walk, bro, and reach to deal with Saladin. One sister had already been through enough, let's keep this peaceful, you know, day of my sister's wedding, whatever. The attack on the castle could continue as long as the chamber where the wedding was taking place would just be unharmed. Saladin actually agreed to this and respectfully only laid siege to every other area of the castle. Next up is the world's worst group project. Religion is a weapon sharper than any blade and has brought more blood than anyone ever could. What started as an archaic way for us to explain our existence has turned into an excuse to commit any atrocity in the name of someone who may not even be there at all. That's what faith is, isn't it? No absolution or surety, God's there protecting you, blessing you, seeing you. Rather simply having faith and belief that they are. When humans decided to have surety our gods were real and lost the whole point of faith, we began to truly use religion and the ideology of gods as a reason for war. Not all groups, however. Mongols were a great example, a religiously and ethnically diverse army. They were just cool with about anything as long as you don't get in the way of the empire. Some Mongols, both individually and in groups, adopted Christian practices, though it's not clear how much of the European political leaders knew about this. But they knew about Khan, at least in a Eurocentric interpretation of him, and that he could be a powerful ally to help knock down the Muslim powers that be, perhaps even open the way for a new Christian Jerusalem again. Early 13th century, it must have been clear that the Christian Crusaders were steadily losing ground, thus they began to reach out to Genghis Khan, supposedly having sent written letters to the notorious leader who could easily be their key in religious persecution. Still, even the political tidal wave of the Mongol Empire wasn't bound to go on forever, and neither were the Muslim-led forces helpless. It all more or less came crashing down in 1260 when Mamluk Sultanate held back the Mongols in Palestine. The descendants of Genghis Khan could and would go no further, halting any bare hope of a Mongol-European alliance. Hey, another fun fact about the Christian Crusaders to tie into that, they peaked like high schoolers. So, the first crusades of the 11th century were the most successful, at least from the European Christian perspective. Crusaders had captured the holy city of Jerusalem for Christ's sake, and that's like 80% of what this whole war is about. But it's also hard to stop something as simultaneously impassioned and nebulous as a holy war once it gets rolling. Surely, some must have also questioned the human cost of all that war, with the many lives and combatants and innocent like snuffed out in the name of raising a right sort of flag over Jerusalem and other cities, even their own emperors and kings. Example, while traveling 12th century Turkey in the Third Crusade, 67-year-old Emperor Frederick Barbarossa is said to have drowned. Some of his heartbroken followers attempted to preserve his body in vinegar for the trip back. Didn't work and they pickled him, called that pickled Anyways, there were many crusades after that first one to tune out about 8 different extended campaigns in addition to various battles and other ill-considered ventures like the stupid children's crusades you've heard about in some of our videos. Ultimately, as Muslim forces like those of the Saracens and the Mamluks took back more and more of the region, it became clear that the first crusade was just the high point for Europeans. One thing they did that some of us still do is listen to the big sky rocks. Throughout history, astronomical phenomena like comets, meteors, and other heavenly objects moving in the sky have been interpreted as omens and portents. We forget that we have all the explanation we have now for what's going on up there, but they didn't. Dude, if the sun rose an hour later than usual, everyone thought it was Armageddon. Imagine that mindset, the level of terror and anxiety. Take the comet of 1517, which was witnessed over the land of the Aztec Mexica ruler Montezuma II and inspired a sense of foreboding ahead of the looming Spanish conquest. Things weren't much different elsewhere. For the Christians and the Muslims of the Crusades, astronomical phenomena was always interpreted as good or bad omens, and most were unwilling to accept the signs in the sky as scientific phenomena only, even when empires like the Ottomans began to delve into astronomy. This is an example of how religion could mow down the paganism that was there before, but it was never truly lost in our conscious. Per Lumen learning, the 11th century members of the People's Crusade seemed especially primed to interpret meteors and comets as favorable omens. Some even went as far as to link sights in the sky with with the end of the world, which could have been a tactic deployed by the church to keep everyone in line, as the church kinda likes to do. It certainly got tied into the First Crusade when a meteor shower was spotted on April 3rd of 1095, and that pushed Pope Urban II to declare a holy war. Could have just been part of a motivation to score as many religious points for himself as possible before the apocalypse came, though.
Number 5. Of rats and men. The trenches were a messed up place to be for a human being. Seriously, I can't recommend it to anyone. But for a small rodent creature like a rat, it may as well be Caesar's Palace, Las Vegas. As a rat, you had access to food scraps, shelter, and everything a growing rat needs. They breed like crazy and had become commonplace amongst the soldiers and decaying bodies, sinking in the hellish mud. The rats grew bigger and bolder, with some cases of rats stealing food right out of soldiers' hands. Sometimes there was so many that soldiers had to essentially hunt them in order to cull the numbers, as there was no system for removing them entirely. On a brighter note though, some soldiers kept them as pets to keep their minds off the impending doom of World War I and trench combat. So you know what, that's kind of cool, get a little rat friend. I'll call him Ralph, I don't know why, Ralph's a cool name. Number 4, No Man's Land. This is what all the chaos is about. The part most soldiers quivering in their boots fear. Maybe it's better to stay with the rats and corpses and freeze. Most soldiers are waiting for one sound. That means two things. A whistle blowing means you're going over the top, or the enemy is coming to you. Either way, someone is going to have to cross No Man's Land, which is the space between two opposing trenches defended on either side with barbed wire, mines, and machine guns, waiting to cut down the enemy charging at full speed. No Man's Land earns its grim nickname as the bodies that fall out there will stay there and become a part of the battlefield. Rolling artillery barrages were meant to aid soldiers in crossing No Man's Land, but no amount of help, liquid courage, or any other factor could really prepare you for that first leap of faith, climbing over the top and facing the enemy. Number 3. Humanity. While a lot of soldiers met their demise to the new inventions of the war like chemical weapons and improved artillery, trench warfare brought out the worst in humanity. The idea of going over the top was to take the enemy trench. Doing so would move the front line up. A war of inches, if you will. However, you cannot take the enemy trench if the enemy is still there. And that is where the bayonets come in, gentlemen. Horrific as it may be, once you made it into the trenches, the warfare looked more like Stone Age fighting than modern. Swords, knives, rifles in close range, clubs, mallets, and homemade blunt objects, and sometimes fists, were used in an intimate setting of a muddy trench just to kill each other, often being some of the most brutal and intense fighting of the war. Even after all that, taking the trench was difficult, but defending it was more, as oftentimes armies went back and forth trying to break enemy lines in between trenches. No thanks. Number 2, sharks with frickin' laser beams. Okay, I know the title's a little misleading, but hear me out. Airplanes and aviation had only been invented a few years prior, or at least a modernized version of them. So humans gained the ability to fly, something people of the past could only dream of. So what's the first thing humans do to this amazing revolutionary invention? Can we weaponize this? Yeah, it's kind of messed up to think about, but when we gained the ability to fly, one of the first real uses we used it for was to destroy each other. Airplanes did play a crucial role in World War I, but not just for ace pilots like the Red Baron, but for reconnaissance. At least the tank was designed for military application. Leave it up to us to strap an automatic weapon and bombs to one of the greatest gifts ever given to mankind. And the sharks with frickin' laser beams attached to their frickin' heads are the same energy. I think so, at least. Number 1. Merry Christmas. This would honestly confuse me if I was a soldier in World War I. It would make me question a lot of things. Things like, why am I here freezing and dying? And shooting at people I don't really have an issue with. The Christmas Truce of 1914 was a truce by the Entente and the Central Powers, more specifically on the Western Front, who climbed out of their trenches to shake hands and share a moment of peace on Christmas. The soldiers, for the most part, got along swimmingly. What's messed up is a few days later, they were back at it again with blowing up and destroying each other. Personally, I don't know how you could do that after sharing a beer with somebody. Just doesn't make any sense. Number 10, the Pig Wars. If there's one thing Americans love besides Dunkin' Donuts, I'm just assuming because your commercials tell me that America runs on Dunkin's. If it's not that, it's manifest destiny. It seems the second the founding fathers and patriots won their freedom, they wanted just a wee bit more and took over what is now the United States of America from coast to coast. Thing is, Britain was also still there in a land known as Canada, or actually British North America, or Rupert's Land if you went to Canadian history class. The British were doing the same thing and expanding westward. They both got to the Pacific West Coast and everything was cool, kosher, great. Well, except for some islands not too far from the mainland. It was heavily debated on who actually owned these islands. Well, it almost turned into another global war. Both Americans and British were living on the island. When a British-owned pig had gone one step too far and eaten out of an American field, the pig paid the price with his life, causing tensions to escalate to the point where the Navy and high-ranking officers got involved. Ooh, not good. Partially being stoked by an American who to this day, no one knows the method to his madness, but apparently he was looking for a fight regardless. Kind of a weird story. All over a pig. Jeez. Number 9. The Anglo-Zanzibar War. One day a disgruntled nephew got rid of his uncle and took the Zanzibar throne for his own. Classic story when it comes to royals, that's what they do. Naturally, the British who said dibs on Zanzibar were not all too pleased, as they had someone else in mind for the throne. Someone who would let them in and keep empiring as they do. So this angry nephew said, "Nah, I don't think so, fam. Ain't having that," and he started to organize the troops, and in a nutshell said, "You know what, why don't you come on in and try and stop me, you and one army?" Well, it was the British army. They did, and it's been recorded as the shortest conflict in human history, lasting only 45 minutes. The nephew escaped to the German embassy and the British moved in. The rest is colonial history. What a great story. Number 8. The Football War. It started with the leaders of Honduras and El Salvador. There was some agriculture and land disputes growing, and the leader of Honduras made it worse by using El Salvador migrants as scapegoats for their problems. Classic dictator move, am I right? Come on. Tensions kept getting hotter to the point where people were being treated differently, and that's not good. And because history is a funny thing, the 1970 World Cup at the time was going to be played by the both feuding nations. The passion, the rage, the anger, the music, they got good music down there, was poured into that game. Well, it was enough for El Salvador to cut all diplomatic ties and after the game, declare war outside of the soccer stadium. For real. People got hurt. It wasn't good. Man, that's rough. Number 7. The Emu War. Say what you will about country folk, but when small town folks band together as one, anything can be accomplished. Well, let's take a trip down under so I can talk about the Emu War. The Great Depression was tough. That was the case for Australian farmers. It was actually a little extra hard for them too. Unfortunately for the farmers, they also had an emu problem. Large birds eating and destroying their crops. I mean, they're massive. You see an emu, they're like this big, they're huge. The government in all her powerful glory decided to step in and lend a hand. They sent out soldiers with trucks and machine blam-blams. So obviously the people got rid of the emus, right? It makes sense. There's armies here, we're gonna get rid of them, no problem. Well, no. What should have been an easy work unfolded into the Emu War. Weeks of trying to hunt down the pesky emus. It was somewhat ineffective. One politician joked that emus should be awarded medals for their bravery in standing up to the soldiers. That's just crazy. That's just, wow. Number 6, World War I. While there are many factors that led to World War I, and some that you might not hear in the classroom, but in a nutshell, new technology, militarism, imperialism, and a general distaste for each other were all thrown into a pot. She was turned on high, and when Archduke Franz Ferdinand was assassinated in Sarajevo, she was turned on high, really hot, when Archduke Franz Ferdinand was assassinated in Sarajevo. A lot of people will tell you that's where it started, and they're not wrong. However, there was a lot of miscommunication and correspondence that had to happen between the empires first. In a series of very tragic events, leaders were on vacation, didn't get messages, people sat on war declarations, and before peace could be made, people were pointing fingers and playing the blame game, which is pretty much what got boots on the ground. And or to the grounds. Wasn't good. So in a nutshell, World War I was started by miscommunication. That's kind of awkward.
Number 5. Passing time. You would assume the Civil War and being part of it and everything I've talked about would give you enough anxiety, but gambling was also a common pastime in between battles. And when I say gambling, I don't mean, okay, it's nighttime, let's throw a few bucks down and play dominoes. No, they would gamble on everything. Horse races, chess, euchre, poker, checkers, cards were popular until the end of the Civil War, when of course they were harder to come by, being so flimsy and all. And when dominoes and cards were out of the picture, soldiers would really go old school and play leapfrog. Yeah, games like that were literally all they had. They would wrestle each other for fun, they would have foot races and bet on them. Bowling would be played using cannonballs to knock down wooden pins, and baseball was also played, but it was a little different back then to how we remember it now. The ball was a lot softer, and there were sometimes only 2 bases. The only way you were out also was if you were hit by the ball, hence the softness that I mentioned. Number 4. Coldest winters. With the winter winds rolling in occasionally, soldiers could no longer play baseball outside and peg each other with baseballs, but what you could do was hit each other with snowballs. A little fun, also a little scary. They called it a snow battle. Yeah, a snow battle too. Battle, way more intense. Soldiers would leave with bruises, black eyes, and sometimes even broken bones. Yeah, these guys were blowing off lots of steam, and they would plan attacks and take it obviously seriously, as they did with their daily civil duties. Even officers got in on this action. When pieces of ice were no longer available to large units to throw at one's head, other winter games would include skating and sledding. Number 3. Food March. In April 1863, a group of mostly women led a march to get the governor's attention. The governor at the time, John Letcher, was joined by President Jefferson Davis. It did not end well. The food situation in the South was not great because food prices changed depending on the status of the war. Outcomes of the battle directly affected prices because they were linked to the CSA's currency. That plus the fact that invading troops from the north would often burn crops when they came through, it was getting worse over time. Come April 1863, this march of women broke windows. They flipped carts until eventually they drew out Governor John Letcher and President Jefferson Davis. John Letcher literally started to throw cash at the protesters. Now, they still didn't stop, obviously, that didn't solve problems. It was so bad that the militia almost had to open fire. Number 2, the alligator. I mentioned soldiers and hot air balloons, so I must mention the United States Navy's first submarine. How fun. This 47-foot long submarine that was paddle powered, yep, you heard me, paddle powered, so you'd be inside and you would do this. We can't call it the USS Alligator because it technically didn't see any active days of combat. In fact, the Alligator, that's what I'll call it, had to be cut loose on its first mission. It was being towed behind the USS Sumter on April 2nd, 1863, right off North Carolina when bad weather hit. The Alligator went down and we haven't found it since. It's still out there. The alligator is still lurking out there. Only a few months after this new weapon went down, the Confederate States of America launched their own sub, the H.L. Huntley, and it sank the USS Housatonic near the coast of Charleston, officially marking the first time a submarine sank an enemy ship. It also immediately sank afterwards, taking the lives of 8 crewmen, so even in victory, you're not safe. They made history but only enjoyed it for minutes. This is all tragic. Number 1. The wage gap. Hundreds of women joined the Civil War and they did so by looking like men. Yeah, they would pull a she's the man and get to work. But the thing is, like I mentioned before with the CSA's currency being affected by the status of the war, soldiers were getting $13 a month roughly. That's double what a woman could make anywhere on the planet, so they really had no choice but to join. This was long before women's suffrage, so if they thought you were a man, you could use that $13 how you wanted. So it comes to no surprise that women would keep this disguise even after the war ended. In 1909, the US Army officially denied that any woman was ever enlisted in the military service of the United States as a member of any organization of the regular or volunteer army at any time during the period of the Civil War. During the Civil War, though, that was the first time in American history when women all came together in a war effort. Thousands of women from the North and South volunteered as nurses.
Alright, number 10. Clothes rations. As the war raged on, there was an immense amount of pressure placed on clothes manufacturers. Uniforms had to be made and maintained, and the increase in air combat required a surplus of parachutes, while the variety of environments required different materials for survivability's sake. As a result, in 1941, the British government introduced clothes rationing, where a number of coupons would be allocated each year. Different types of clothes would be worth different amounts of coupons, with 66 coupons given for every adult at the beginning of the rationing. As the war continued, this allocation began to shrink, and in 1945, the regular amount of coupons given per person was 24. Despite the war's end the following year, rationing continued until 1949 as the economy recovered, but had laid the foundations for a different type of fashion, generally in the style of informality. Number 9. Patriotic knitting. One of the more fascinating results of the wartime strain on clothes was the way in which it changed hobbies into forms of support. In the end, as husbands went off to war and wives asked how to help, the answer was given that they ought to knit. Evidence for this can be found in some fascinating wartime propaganda, which honestly deserves its own list, but my absolute favorite might be the poster asking if you remember Pearl Harbor and answering itself with Pearl Harder. Despite the cute ways in which the activity was promoted, knitting did end up having an effect, as even prior to Pearl Harbor, Americans were knitting sweaters and mittens to be sent off to the Eastern Front. Arguably, the fad peaked when Eleanor Roosevelt was photographed knitting for the war effort. As a result of this, some women had reportedly begun friendly competitions based on quantity of clothes knit, with one Scottish woman even hitting around 1,000 pairs of mittens by 1941. Number 8. Fashion is out of fashion. Other ways in which propaganda was set in favor of rationing was through the manipulation of what is considered fashionable. The effects of this will soon be seen, but one of the oldest publications in the history of fashion coined a phrase that caught on like wildfire. Fashion is out of fashion. While this leads more into the ways in which propaganda can allow for significant social changes, and it's also something that no one, not even you, are immune to, it's interesting to point out how wrong this was. Rosie the Riveter, for instance, was a remarkable piece of propaganda that's synonymous with the entirety of the Second World War, and yet she's presented in a way that is still somewhat fashionable. Thin eyebrows, applied makeup, and styled hair. All of these are things that you wouldn't have seen in a wartime factory, but it worked as intended and allowed for an increase in patriotic fervor far from the front. Number 7. Blackout buttons. When German bombers began to make strikes on British cities, a major problem was coming to be more common. With the increased availability of electricity, it was then easy for bombers to pick electric power plants as targets, and eventually they started hitting their marks. A city under siege and darkness will be prone to mass panic and the fatalities that commonly occur with such things, and so a plan was devised to make for an easier transition. UV absorbing buttons and pins were created and distributed, some materials even making their way into the fabric of clothes as a whole. As a result, accidents were reduced in blackout conditions, and the material continued to be produced post-war with hobby figurines. However, more darkly, the material did make it easier to identify bodies in the collapsed rubble of homes. Number 6. Dog wool. After the implementation of clothes rationing, women who were not prepared to face the shortage ended up having to get creative. While the practice had begun in a minor way at the tail end of World War I, in 1941, business was booming in the dog wool industry, and it was soon discovered that some breeds' furs were better for spinning than others. Labradors and Spaniels' fur didn't work so well, and despite their visual similarity to sheep, Poodle's fur was the worst of all. The best breeds ended up being Collies, Sheepdogs, Chows, and Pekingese. Even with that, the trend died the moment clothes rationing ended, likely to the dog's satisfaction. And our noses.
Number 5. Battle of Two Sisters. The third battle that took place on the night of June 11th was the Battle of Two Sisters. This battle, as well as Mount Harriet and Mount Longdon, were brigade-sized operations that all happened, remind you, on the same night. The British were commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Andrew Whitehead, and the support consisted of Royal Marines of 45 Commando, the anti-tank troop from 40 Commando, with support from 29 Commando Regiment and naval support from the HMM Glamorgan. Originally, 45 Commando was to seize Two Sisters Mountain overnight, hiding in the darkness, and if there was enough time, use said darkness to advance onto Tumbledown Mountain. Argentine forces were ready, so the second phase of the attack was unable to happen as they wanted to. In total, 22 British soldiers lost their lives, a destroyer was hit, as well as 3 helicopters, 22 were killed with 47 wounded. Number 4. Friendly fire. On the 6th of June, 1982, an incident occurred which claimed the lives of 4 British soldiers. Navy destroyer HMS Cardiff destroyed the friendly Gazelle helicopter. So what happened? How does something like this happen in the first place? Well, the HMS Cardiff was on lookout for Argentinian forces. Supplies coming into the Falklands Islands, of course, is a no-go. So on the night of June 5th, HMS Cardiff was stationed east of the islands, and at 2 a.m. they detected the British Gazelle helicopter, thinking that it was an attack. The helicopter was actually making a routine delivery with both equipment and soldiers on board. So what went wrong here? Well, first, after the Sea Dart missile was fired, the next morning it was assumed enemy fire was initially responsible. The Ministry of Defense stated they didn't want to cause further anguish to relatives while they were trying to piece together what went wrong, so it was a lot happening in one night. So some articles made it sound like they tried to hide it. It was really just they had their hands full and it was an accident. A lack of communication between the Army and the Navy was to blame, but not one individual per se, confirms the Board of Inquiry. The 5th Infantry Brigade had not notified anybody of the helicopter's flight, so it was a surprise to many, especially coming in at that speed to that location. The radar also doesn't look good at 2 a.m. when you see that blip coming in. And on top of that, the helicopter's identification friend or foe transmitter, the IFF, it was turned off at this point because it had previously interfered with the Army's anti-aircraft system. So it was just an accident. Number 3. HMS Sheffield. The Type 42 guided missile destroyer was the second Royal Navy ship to be named after the city of Sheffield, Yorkshire. In response to the Argentine invasion, Sheffield was sent to retake the islands on April 2nd, 1982. Captain Salt had ordered the ship to change course every 90 seconds to avoid submarine threat. The 2 weeks prior to the attack, Argentine forces were training against their own ships, which happened to include Type 42 destroyers, the same class as the HMS Sheffield. So they knew the radar detection distances and their reaction times like the back of their hand at this point. They used a technique called pecking the lobes, which meant that they would avoid detection by flying on the side of the emitting radar, out of sight. The destroyer was hit on May 4th and foundered while under tow 6 days later on May 10th. Number 2. The Battle of Seal Cove. Just west of Lively Island during the Falklands War, the Battle of Seal Cove was also underway. On May 22, the British frigates HMS Brilliant and HMS Yarmouth were supporting Operation Sutton. This was happening right off of San Carlos Bay when they received orders to stop and take over an Argentinian coastal supply boat, the ARA Monsunan. It was a 326-ton British coaster that had previously been owned by the Falkland Islands Company, but during the invasions, the ship was captured. It was also loaded with 150 drums of fuel and 250 sacks of flour. The HMS Yarmouth opened fire and forced that vessel to beach on Seal Cove. And finally, coming in at number 1, young soldiers. It's important to remember how young these brave soldiers were at the time. I wanted to finish this list off by sharing the words of a Royal Navy veteran who was only a teenager during the Falklands War. Craig Mac McDermott was 17 at the time. Craig was on the HMS Antrim in 1982 when conflict took off. The actual location of the Falkland Islands is different than most expect. Craig explains his initial thoughts at the time. He shared this in the Daily Record last November. When I first heard of the Falkland Islands, like many people, I thought they were just off the north of Scotland. I didn't know where they were, but there's no way I will ever forget them after everything I've witnessed. We were naive and too young to understand the severity of what we were about to encounter. The air attacks were constant and there were several injured during each of the attacks. The suffering was indescribable and something that I'll never be able to forget. Thank you for your service, Craig.
Number 10. Live long enough to become the villain. Saigon isn't Saigon anymore, and while many great efforts were made to thwart the Viet Cong, the finger quote good guys lost. There's a little bit of irony in the story, however. Think about it for a second. America was a colony who fought a very hard battle for their independence against the most powerful foreign power at the time. Fast forward to the Vietnam War, and here they are trying to fight a war for independence against the most powerful foreign nation. Different in details, but the same in broader terms. Sadly, it was a tragic loss of life on both sides, and while you always want to pick out the hero in every story, in war, it's not exactly black and white. More of a gray area. Number 9. No more heroes. Looking at photos of soldiers coming home from war, you'll see people hugging, cheering, laughing, kissing, and raising a glass to toast the return of their sons and daughters. There's a famous picture from VJ Day that you've probably seen, a sailor kissing in the streets. However, sadly for Vietnam vets, the return home was not with welcome arms, cheering crowds, or celebrating of any kind, really. The veterans were met with pretty much the opposite. Vietnam was the first war to ever really get the media coverage that it did. For the first time, Americans at home got to see what was going on. And it wasn't pretty. Over time, disapproval for the war grew to the point where it was protested, and soldiers did not receive the care that they needed. As much as we'd like to meme nowadays with Vietnam flashbacks, these soldiers' mental health was not dealt with. PTSD, depression, and a country that didn't want them were very real for shell-shocked men returning home. Number 8. One of many wars. Despite Walter Cronkite and Bob Hope's coverage of the war, and that's kind of a joke for people over the age of 60, Vietnam was a war in a series of armed conflicts during the Cold War. Yes, for Americans it was the most memorable to say the least, but there were many hot wars that took place during the Cold War. I'm not really sure how it got that name, but okay. The Vietnam War was a byproduct of the Cold War, just like these other wars and conflicts. For example, the Ethiopian Civil War, the Ogden War, the Dominican Civil War, the 6 Days War, just to name a few. Vietnam was the last time US forces would fully send troops on the ground like that for at least a few years. All the previous wars I mentioned were more the style of proxy wars. Basically, the United States and Soviet Union would vicariously fight through much smaller, less powerful nations. Basically, it's like getting your big brother to fight for your little brother. Number 7. Rainbow chemicals. Remember the last time when I talked about Agent Orange? Well, there was actually a whole rainbow of colored lethal chemicals used. Orange for trees, Agent Blue to destroy the rice supply, and a few other varieties and colors as well. They became known as the rainbow herbicides. The side effects of these chemicals were horrible, creating birth defects in children whose parents had been exposed. Many people still live with these conditions, and unfortunately, children born today still have birth defects. Clearly this stuff is awful and should never be used again. I went to the chief's lab last night and he took a look at the chemicals and he said, that's not it. Number 6. Ho Chi Minh. The man behind the madness, or at least the communist revolution that he so desperately wanted to take over. Born in 1890 in what was then Indochina, a French colony, his beginnings of being a leader and anti-colonial views started quite young after being expelled from a school for such beliefs. He eventually found his way to France in 1919, where the Treaty of Versailles claimed Vietnamese freedom. His pleas, however, were not heard. A Japanese occupation during World War II and a rise in communism in the East was slowly adding ingredients for a revolution stew. Weird metaphor, but let's run with it. France, wanting to take back their colony, had started the Vietnam War. Now in charge of the communist revolution, it would be a decades-long fight with America and South Vietnam before claiming their bloody victory. Could have been prevented. That's crazy too. Like, he went to France and he's like, give us freedom. They're like, no, sacre bleu, you go back to where you came from.
Number 5. National flour. While flour was sometimes permitted, flour wasn't encouraged and was one time banned for household use. It was still being allowed commercially for like other cakes and biscuits and stuff. But they had to supply a replacement, so wartime specific products were launched. One was called the national flour, wheat meal essentially. It was gray in color and had a lot of bran in it. It wasn't as smooth or as soft as flour, so women would desperately like sieve it through their stockings to kind of get like a nice like desired soft texture. Didn't always work. They also used this as a way to feed their chickens without having to spend money on rations. This flour was the key ingredient as to what would be called the national loaf. Nutritionists, funny enough, loved it for some reason because it was like really high in fiber and tried to fight for the bread to be popular post-war. But unfortunately, it wasn't very tasty. It sucked. It was often referred to as Hitler's secret weapon because everyone hated it so much. On the upside though, the government was able to keep the supply plentiful enough, so bread was never rationed. Number 4. Spam. Oh, spam. The canned meat people still seem to love. The British tradition for mealtime was to have at least 1 meat and 2 veg. You can guess what stood in for the meat. Spam. The government tried to introduce the Brits to corned beef, an insult. So then they tried something called snoek, which was like a snake mackerel from South Africa. People didn't even like to talk about that one. But then spam came over from the US. It was filling and tasty, just enough to fill that little spot in their tummy. Although it couldn't replace a good steak, it had a long shelf life, and it was perfect for troops in the trenches. Number 3. Pig and chicken clubs. One of the things I love about England or the UK in general is that everyone, even in suburban neighborhoods, have chickens in their backyard. Okay, maybe not everyone, but it's really popular and it's kind of normal. My aunt has always kept them in her backyard since as far back as I can remember. But it wasn't always like that. In the 1940s, commercially farmed hens had to be sold off as food because they didn't have enough to feed them. This led to a massive egg shortage. Only 1 egg was allowed per person per week. Unless you were expecting mother, you were allowed 2. But as a result, people who hadn't kept chickens before this started to in their backyards. You had to give up your egg ration, but got to have more grain rations instead. The same thing happened with pigs. Neighborhoods would keep pigs, feed them together, and then share in them. Some would even keep their pigs private, but they had to be registered so you could give up your meat coupons, but some never did. So it was a little bit cheeky. Number 2. Roosevelt coffee. I'm not gonna lie to you guys, some days I really couldn't do this job without coffee. Like I really couldn't. It's a problem. And I'm sure many people feel the same, but sadly for them, back then, coffee was rationed. Pretty much every ounce of coffee was shipped overseas, making coffee impossible to come by in the States. Americans were tasked with drinking less than 1 cup a day. That's like compared to everyone else's 4 cups a day. Introducing Roosevelt coffee. People started making it to help fill in the gap. It was simply reused coffee grounds mixed with ingredients like chicory and postum. It made a kind of watery version of a cup of joe. The chicory added a little spice to it, while postum, a molasses-like substance, added color and flavor, I guess? It wasn't a good time. But last but not least, Hershey's chocolate. The men who took up arms in the trenches faced some of the worst horrors ever imagined. To them, any day, any moment could be their last. A pretty bleak world to live in and day out. Morale was crucial to maintain, as it could mean the difference between life and death for many soldiers. One way to help support them was food. On June 6, 1944, the Allies stormed the beaches of Normandy during the D-Day invasion. But what you may not know is that an unlikely treat fueled them throughout the mission: Hershey's chocolate bars. Hershey's was approached by the US Army in 1937, way long before the war started, about creating a bar for emergency rations. They had to weigh 4 ounces, be high in energy, withstand high temperatures, and taste a little better than a boiled potato. They didn't want it to be too tasty, otherwise they'd run out. It was called the D ration bar, a blend of chocolate, sugar, cocoa butter, skim milk, and oat flour. And it ended up not tasting too great, but it gave the Allies enough oomph to seize the day.
Number 10. Third party involvement. You'd be forgiven if you thought the Vietnam War was a really bad war between the United States and Vietnam. Literally every book, movie, or depiction of the late 60s conflict is GIs in green walking through the jungle brush as Huey helicopters buzz over the tree canopies. Chaos surrounding as a Rolling Stones or other influential song from the era plays in the background. The camera pans out to show how thick the jungle is, as the soldiers are always looking for someone named Charlie. Wonder if they found him. Forrest Gump jokes aside, good movie, go see it. Yes, that is the Vietnam War for the US, but there were actually a few other countries involved, more than you might think. The Soviet Union and China were 100% supporting Vietnamese communists. The French years prior were trying to claim back an old colony, and Australia also sent soldiers to support the effort. And perhaps most strangely, South Korea sent soldiers to aid South Vietnam, so the same thing didn't happen to them. That's just a crazy mix, isn't it? Number 9. Are you done? If you ever find yourself getting captured by spooky, scary communists, maybe you should remember Doug Hegdel, a sailor who was blown overboard by a ship gun and washed ashore to probably the worst shore to wash up on in the 1960s. Maybe that or a nude beach full of hippies, I digress. Doug eventually found himself in a super friendly POW camp. Doug knew he was going to be in some trouble, and if he didn't think fast, was going to be subjected to torment that isn't appropriate for any YouTube or TV show on air. So, what did Doug do? A daring escape, you say? Eliminated all his enemies from the stealth that only a cardboard box could provide? Hang upside down with tri-light night vision goggles and wait for guards to walk by? No, my stealth gaming friends. He played dumb. Very dumb, in order to convince the enemy that he wasn't worth very much, so that in theory they would let him go. Not convinced, the Viet Cong tried to get Doug to spew propaganda. Doug made a 5-head play and pretended he couldn't read. He pretended to be 3-head. After many efforts, the Viet Cong declared him the incredibly stupid one. He was eventually released back to the US, where he gave some intel on the Viet Cong that he remembered over his time locked up, which he remembered to the tune of Old MacDonald Had a Farm. Doesn't get any more American than that. Old MacDonald had a farm. Yeah, okay, anyway. Number 8, 360 all scope. Remember the days of Modern Warfare 2? Remember hitting those early spawn shots on high rise with the intervention? Yes, me too. Times have changed, and although the days of waking up early on Saturday morning to rip a little Call of Duty while your parents fight in the next room may be gone for me, they are not forgotten. I wasn't the best sniper out there, but I could hit a shot or two. However, no energy drink fueled YY ladder stall compares to the White Feather. Meet Carlos Hathcock, a sharpshooter from the Vietnam War whose accuracy would have Robin Hood questioning his bowstrings. He is credited with taking down a lot of enemies from quite a staggering distance away. However, his biggest claim to fame would be his Robin Hood splitting arrow moment. One day in the Vietnam jungle, he spotted an enemy sniper and terminated the threat. The thing is that Hathcock's bullet went through the enemy's scope and ended his sniping career. That's one heck of a shot. Mom, get the camera! Number 7, tall courage. Richard Flaherty was unusual to most US soldiers deployed in Vietnam at the time. He was a short king, measuring in just short of 5 feet, which was the US requirement for soldiers at the time. His training proved that while he was short, he was just as effective as the other soldiers. Nicknamed the Mighty Mouse and the Giant Killer when in the field, his courage and efforts would see him join the famous 101st Airborne, where he was sent on search and destroy missions in the thick jungle brush. His efforts would eventually earn him a Silver Star, and would wind up in the very tough yet mysterious Green Berets. Never judge a book by its cover. Number 6. Yeah, of course I am the American. Larry Thorne was a soldier and a great leader for US forces training civilians in Vietnam. Distinguished with medals and wasn't afraid to get dirty. He helped defend a base from a Vietnamese attack, and if he wasn't there, it most likely would have gone FUBAR. However, that's not what's so messed up about Mr. Thorne. Larry was hiding something rather interesting. Being a little bit older, it made sense that he had been in the military for a while. However, it wasn't the US Army. Larry had fought in 2 other armies previously. The Finland Army, which was his home against the Soviets in the Winter War, and more disturbingly, fought with the German Waffen SS. Yeah, I am an American and I have no prior actions that would cause you to have any suspicion. Yeah. Sadly for the man with all that experience, he perished in a helicopter crash in 1965. His body was recovered years later and was given full military honors when buried. You never know who you're standing beside. Number 5. Mad Jack Churchill. Again, not exactly its own war, but Buddy here was fighting his own war basically. Meet Mad Jack Churchill, a British commando who went into battle with a sword and bagpipes. I'm gonna say that again for the people in the back. Went into a modern war with modern weapons using a sword and bagpipes. When asked about his medieval ways, Jack replied with, "Any officer who goes into action without his sword is improperly dressed." To add to this already insanity that is Mad Jack Churchill, he holds the record, or title, for the last recorded longbow kill in history. That's insane. When in 1940 a poor German soldier met the business end of Jack's barbed arrows, his military career was very impressive, having become a commando and escaping capture from Germans later in the war. He would then marry his wife and stay with her happily ever after for 55 years. Why is there not a movie of that guy yet? There should be a movie of that guy. Number 4. The Football War. Everyone loves football, and next on the World Cup's coming home. Okay, bad impressions aside, this war is over football. Well, sort of. It does have a little to do with land and agricultural disputes between Honduras and El Salvador. The dictator of Honduras at the time began to use El Salvadorians as a scapegoat, which made tensions sour between the 2 Central American countries. As it turns out, it was time for the 1970 World Cup and they were facing each other. But after some classic sabotage by both teams, tensions got even worse as Honduras began to crack down on immigrant farmers from El Salvador. They'd had enough. Cut all diplomatic ties and declared war. Sometimes referred to as the 102nd War since it was so short, but sadly thousands of people died and it didn't really solve anything. But we still got football though, right? Come on, everyone loves football. Number 3, the Falklands War. If you look at the globe and take a look at the very southern tip of South America, then slightly east of that, you won't see very much. And that's because there isn't very much there. However, what is there is a very small island called the Falklands. It was colonized by Britain, France, and Spain in the 1700s, but because it was so far away, it wasn't really a top priority for any of the imperial powers. Everyone kinda had more important stuff going on. Well, fast forward a few hundred years and now Argentina wanted a piece of the action. Thinking taking the islands was going to be a cakewalk, Argentine forces took over. Britain, feeling like Argentina didn't respect the holy playground rule of dibs since they left a plaque on the island stating that it was theirs, went to war. A war which sadly did cost a few hundred lives. Today it's remembered for its losses and the leadership of Iron Lady Margaret Thatcher. Number 2. The enemy of mine enemy is mine friend. This is just too weird not to mention. May of 1945 was just a bad time to be a German evil mustache man. Actually, he was kaput, but the war still raged on. The weirdest battle of the month would have to be the Battle of Castle Itter. High-value French prisoners were being held in a castle that had been transformed into a prison. A small American force approached the castle when the Germans were spotted. The Germans immediately surrendered, and then offered to aid the Americans in liberating the French prisoners. Yep, that's right. Trouble is, there was a German SS force that wasn't going to let that happen. So, it was Americans and Germans versus some naughtier Germans. and after an intense firefight, the joint force would be victorious and the prisoners freed. Number 1. Second-rate ostrich.
Any remaining Jedi will be hunted down and defeated. Any collaborators will suffer the same fate.
That was terrible. Anyway, sorry, that's my Palpatine side coming through. Sorry about that, guys. This is gonna be the weirdest thing you're gonna hear all week. Okay, I'm willing to bet most of you folks at home have never heard of the Emu War, which may be because the Aussies don't want you to know about it, as it is a little embarrassing, but basically this is how it went down. The Great Depression sucked for everyone. Australia was hit rather hard as they relied on agriculture exports. People just weren't buying. To make matters worse, there was an abundance of pests destroying crops. The worst of these crop eaters are knockoff ostriches, emus. So many emus were running amok that the farmers asked the military for help. The military, not wanting to mess around, obliged by sending a couple of men with 2 Lewis machine guns. When the pack of bloodthirsty emus was shot at, they ran away, and only a small number were killed. This happened multiple times, so much so that it was jokingly said that the emus should receive medals for their valor. Of an estimated 20,000 emus wreaking havoc, only about 1,000 were terminated. The army also spent a lot of machine gun rounds for this operation, so in a nutshell, the emus kinda won. Yikes. Number 10. Crying Wolf. The Gulf of Tonkin incident was a conflict between Vietnam and US forces in 1964. What's messed up about that is that 2 days later, it happened again. Actually, it didn't. Big prank. The second incident was fabricated by the US just to justify ramping up their presence in Vietnam. Sadly, it worked, as the next 8 years in Vietnam would end up being a total snipe storm for the US, as they would encounter problems abroad and at home. Thank goodness this is the only time the American government would ever lie about anything ever again, right? This was officially declassified decades later. Number 9. Agent Orange. The world agreed not to use chemical warfare after the First World War, as it was extremely cruel and lethal. So, you might be surprised that America used chemical weapons during the Vietnam War. Agent Orange, brought to you by the Dow Chemical Company, was a herbicide and defoliant dropped and sprayed from air vehicles to cut down the thick jungle brush. Viet Cong soldiers were excellent at living off the land and concealing themselves in the jungle. Bad guy hides in jungle, you remove the jungle. Makes sense. The chemical was extremely effective, but what's so messed up was the negative health side effects. Soldiers that were exposed to the chemical developed cancers years after the war. But what's even more crazy is how it affected the Vietnamese people. It created children with really bad health defects, and to this day there are many people who live with ill side effects of Agent Orange. That's just not right, man. That's wrong. That is so wrong, dude. Number 8. French Indochina. The US was not the first superpower trying to tame Vietnam. Vietnam used to be called French Indochina, and it used to be a colony of France. And when they no longer wanted to be a part of that, France came down to give them a piece of their minds. But you can probably guess how that went, considering the US was there 20 years later trying to do the same thing. While France was trying to keep a colony and the US was trying to stop communism from spreading to other countries, Vietnam was trying to fight for its independence, which is ironic for America because that's how they became a country. And yes, I know that the communist movement in Vietnam wasn't great by any standards, but the regime America was trying to put in place was no better. As much as France would have liked to keep Vietnam, times were changing, and there was no victory in sight, with or without American support. Number 7. Well, that escalated quickly. Up until 1967, the war was bad, but it was nothing compared to what was going to happen in 1968. In 1968, the Viet Cong launched the Tet Offensive, a massive military campaign designed to destroy the foreign invaders. All across the country, key targets were being attacked, and it seemed overnight that the war went from a 6 all the way to an 11. What's so messed up though is even though the VC did not achieve major victories, it was costing a lot of American lives. With the Viet Cong using the Ho Chi Minh Trail, the war not only escalated in Vietnam, but had reached neighboring nations like Cambodia. This had an effect on the war back home. The US thought and told people it would be a quick war. They had the advantage. But after the VC flexing their military might, it was clear that more US soldiers would be needed to win the war, which some people were beginning to question in the first place. And as time went on, most people would protest America's involvement. Number 6. A terrible loss of life. The Vietnam War is one of the most important events in US history, and honestly world history too. It was a very hot war during the Cold War, which we could do a whole video on that itself. A time of superpowers ready to annihilate one another at the push of a red button. Thousands of young men volunteered or were drafted to fight in a war that would humble the very powerful country. 58,141 Americans would lose their lives in order to contain communism. Of that 61%, they were under the age of 21. That is an insane, I can't even believe that. The Vietnamese lost over 300,000 people in the conflict. The war is remembered for being a tragic loss of life, and the domino theory that communism would spread throughout the world if containment was not initiated didn't happen, as most countries today just aren't communist.
Number 5. Viscose rayon. Well documented in the book Fake Silk by Paul David Blanc, when the world went to war, the commodity of viscose rayon saw a massive boom. However, the method of creating the chemical links in order to build viscose rayon was extremely toxic, resulting in an unprecedented loss of life as the effects were felt in the 60s. This was felt in particular on the Axis side of power, with prisoners of war and political prisoners being forced to produce the material at an extremely high rate. The conditions were so bad that reportedly, German factories implemented nets around the second floor of the buildings to prevent their workers from taking their own lives. Number 4. Make do and mend. Another excellent wartime piece of propaganda. This piece was yet another effect of wartime clothes rationing, generally focusing on ensuring that civilians made their clothes last as long as possible. Make do and mend was a social movement that hoped to lighten the impact on morale. The general idea started with simply using whatever materials you had to fix any clothes that were damaged, but eventually it spiraled into homemade fashion. Initially, it was simply done by wearing soldiers' clothes while they were away, then turning worn down clothes into new clothes, then making clothes out of food bags or belts from cellophane. Reportedly, few husbands ever noticed. Number 3. She wears the pants. Hard to imagine now, but work with me. Back in the day, women wearing pants was a bit of a faux pas. But as the whole patriotic utilitarian image crept into popularity, most of these social conventions were demolished. Interestingly, post-war there was an immediate push to return to these established norms, which was fought against vehemently. With nearly a decade's worth of time to become entrenched, the social pushback was difficult to justify beyond the general aesthetic means, as men just wanted to see women wearing dresses again. The counterpoint was that it was still a nightmare to get any clothes at all, but it was also pretty fair to state that pants were just fairly comfortable. Just one more of those little pushes in the direction of increased autonomy. Number 2. Uniform hierarchy. An interesting note was in the cultural impact of how men's uniforms were perceived by prospective wives. As it turned out, there was a sort of hierarchy to how men were valued that was separate from their actual rank, and it was entirely determined by the color of their uniform. With the British military, the PBI, which stands for Poor Bloody Infantry, were at the bottom of the barrel, also referred to as the brown jobs. Then there were the naval officers, who were seen as quite fetching with their dark blue uniforms. Further up than those was the Royal Air Force Blue. In at number 1, Woodies. When Japan entered the war, their stranglehold on rubber made the material virtually impossible to find. As a result, the supplies required to produce the soles for shoes dwindled, and the search for new material began. According to Harper's Bazaar, the material ended up being wood. Woodies, as they were called, were a strange type of shoes and apparently difficult to wear when compared to most other shoes. So much so that magazines selling them apparently had to publish guides on how to properly walk with them.
Number 10. Rationing. So I think it's important to begin this list by talking about rationing. Lots of food was sent away to help the soldiers going off to fight in the war. That means that each person only had a certain amount of coupons that they were allowed to use to buy things like eggs, sugar, flour, etc. There were less shipments coming from other companies due to the threat of U-boat attacks, so food became really expensive and people panicked, rushing to stores to stock up. In 1918, the government decided to introduce rationing so as to develop a way to share food fairly. That way grocery stores didn't face a ridiculous shortage of toilet paper. Even the King and Queen of England had ration cards, and the cards could only be used at certain shops. If you were caught stealing or cheating, then you could be fined or even thrown into prison. Fortunately, nobody starved, but people were often left hungrier than usual. To aid with that missing spot in their tummy, people began cultivating their own gardens, and preserved jams, pickles, and chutneys became really popular. Number 9. Vegetarian chopped liver. So with rations and war being introduced, people had to get used to a whole different way of life. If they were craving one of their favorites for dinner, they had to get inventive. Hence, vegetarian chopped liver. It won't surprise you to learn that during World War II, a lot of Jewish families in occupied territories were advised to stretch their food rations very thin, which often meant filling in a recipe with something a lot cheaper. Chopped liver was a staple dish, so to find a way to fill the gap, they created a vegetarian version. They found a way to make it, kind of, using fresh fruits, vegetables, meat was swapped out for green beans, peas, onions, hard-boiled eggs, if possible, and crackers. Number 8. Mock goose. So the war is on, rations are in play, but Christmas is still coming, and hey guys, it's Thanksgiving this weekend too. Happy Thanksgiving, Americans. What on earth was going to take the place of a delicious roast Christmas goose? Well, I introduced to you mock goose. I'm just realizing that World War eras were actually pretty vegetarian friendly, because no one could really afford meat. Mock goose was a combination of sliced potatoes, apples, cheese, sage, vegetable stock, and a teaspoon of flour. They would place a layer of sliced potatoes, then apples, sage, seasoning, cheese, and then repeat. Basically a potato, apple, and cheese lasagna. I'm glad they didn't try to make it look like a goose, because it's almost worse eating something that doesn't taste what it looks like, you know? Number 7. War cake. Though the recipe was printed in the Second World War, it also made the rounds in World War I. People weren't going to stop craving delicious tea cakes and sweets just because of the war. If anything, it made them crave it more. But they had to make do with what they had. Recipes like this one often appeared in women's magazines, as food conservation was seen as a way women contributed to the war effort. Canadian war cake goes as follows, and though the ingredients don't seem that odd, the making was a bit strange. It includes 2 cups of sugar, 2 cups of hot water, 3 tablespoons of lard or a fat, 1 teaspoon of salt, cloves, cinnamon, seedless raisins, not a raisin fan. This would then all be boiled together and then cooled. They would boil that together. I've never actually read a recipe like that at all. Then 4 cups of flour would be added and a tablespoon of soda and baking powder. The consistency of the cake was closer to that of a dense spread, but when you've got to take it day by day, it was a small joy. Number 6. The potato pasty. Potatoes! I love potatoes. Easy to grow, versatile, tasty. Potatoes became the go-to saviors of many a recipe. The British government even handed out leaflets encouraging people to get inventive with the potato. There were recipes from the normal baked potatoes, biscuits, and even something called a potato piglet, which was supposed to substitute, somehow, a sausage roll. But then of course there was the potato pasty. It was a pie pastry which contained margarine or a fat was also really hard to come by, flour, potato, and salt. They had to eat it as soon as it was hot, as it had a tendency to dry up once it cooled down. They also used potatoes in general with other recipes to make them more filling.
During the Crusades, one guy accepted a side quest, fight a bear. That absolute legend was Godfrey of Bouillon, who started the royal line of Jerusalem off with a bang, evidently. So naturally, given he lived in the 11th century and the way that medieval chroniclers like to play fast and loose with truth on occasion, it's no wonder that the real man is tied up in some wild stories. And we really do mean wild, like banging biddies, drugs, and rock and roll. Godfrey was a noble knight, crusader, and flighty intercourse fiend, and overall chill dude. He was out twiddling his thumbs on his horse, enjoying the weather, when he comes across some poor sad sap who's just trying to collect sticks getting mauled by a bear. Godfrey, sword at the ready, galloped in to help, but gets straight up yeeted from his own horse by the bear. He is at a hardcore disadvantage for a while, but all his Tin Man armor and strength worked in his favor, and some help from another knight passing by as well. With his own history of mud wrestling, Godfrey beat Winnie the Pooh off himself. Naturally, he was roughed up something awful, but homeboy lived and had 2 witnesses to the account, and the tale was recorded by Albert of Athens. Regardless, while some may be skeptical as to whether or not Godfrey actually went mano a mano with a bear, we do know he went on to rule Jerusalem for a single year, and his younger brother Baldwin later became the first king of Jerusalem. For some reason, during the Crusades, the Europeans made up an imaginary rich BFF. The Christian crusade was desperate, wimpy lot since day one. They wanted a powerful foreign ally so bad, but every foreign would look at their crusade and their religion, suck their teeth, and go, I appreciate the offer, but the Crusades' desire for a powerful foreign ally was so strong people just collectively invented one instead, like a superpowered imaginary friend on a geopolitical scale. Prester John, a rumored king who was not only incredibly rich and influential, but definitely wanted to help only the Christian cause. The basics of the myth is Prester John was both a physical king and a Christian holy man like a pope or an archbishop. His faraway lands, variously described as being in somewhere like Ethiopia or Japan, were full of wonders and riches, including vast gold deposits and a fountain of youth. Rumors of things they'd heard of greater empires having, and that's where everyone knew the greater empires were. If only history would remember it that way, but erasure. Some writings even claim that his kingdom had a garden of paradise, the original earth of which Adam and Eve were evicted from long ago. And if he could only make contact with the Crusaders, he would totally help them and take them back to the Holy Land in a heartbeat. But damn, he's just like he can't right now, he's on vacation. You know, only no one ever found Prester John. Sure, there were plenty of letters and chronicles daring to outline his kingdom and way of life, but no one was able to say that he'd actually met the ruler. And as the centuries rolled on and Europeans began to visit Africa and Asia, it soon became clear Prester John was either very good at hiding or had never existed. Like Jack and the Beanstalk, these morons actually had a holy goose. It's safe to say that the most medieval Europeans who went on the crusade to the Holy Land did so at the urging of a powerful, sometimes even charismatic individual. Now whether that's a god or some lunatic king or a combo of a lunatic king saying he's a god, which is probably just the voice of the half-developed twin's brain sharing a skull caused by all the in-family relations. As religious intensity of the Crusades built, more and more people felt it was their Christian duty to free the region, or at least gawk at the fighting and maybe take part in some adventuring and plundering opportunities. Historic erasure, but make it fun. The growing tide of interested folks combined with the church making everyone feel special eventually produced some pretty weird leaders, like a Goose. In 1096, People's Crusade was an unofficial one that wasn't technically sanctioned by the Pope, and that's what made a crusade, by the way. Yet plenty of regular folks took part, and even some following a holy goose. In one version of the tale, a poor woman is trailed by one of her geese, and through a series of misinterpretations and misunderstandings, people began to believe that this was a divinely inspired goose leading them. Chroniclers jumped on the chance to make these guys look like historical idiots, and they were, but so was everyone of the Crusades, so joke's on you chroniclers, y'all are in the club too. Seriously, who tries to follow a goose to Jerusalem anyways? Especially since by most medieval understandings, animals didn't have a soul, so they couldn't understand the divine to begin with. How are you guys gonna follow it all the way there, give them a tip, and then say move along, you aren't allowed in? That's unfair. Now for the poor people of Christ who ate the other poor people, not of Christ. Or sometimes of Christ, they didn't really care. Usually once that type of behavior starts up, either God is super involved, like the Mexica Aztecs, or it is super not. As mentioned, there is ton of crusades you could go on back then. The purpose of crusades began to splinter over time, and quite a few people went for religious reasons, sure, perhaps wanting to wash away their sins in one great grand gesture. Others, it seems, were more in it to exercise their xenophobia and the possible financial gain from plundering foreign lands. And for many, those motivations got all mixed up and produced some very strange situations, like how the Tafurs were a group of crusaders who took strict vows of poverty to the point where they wore rough clothing, discarded all of their weapons, which were mostly rusty farm tools, and ate grass and roots to survive. The Tafurs also had a reputation for ruthless war making and plundering, to the point where over time they creeped out even other crusaders. Like, they could often be relied on to throw themselves wholeheartedly into battle, but they also devastate innocent people and settlements that they come across. Chroniclers often called the Tafurs depraved, and depraved is the best word for what they became notorious for doing. The reported acts of people eating during the siege of Antioch, where the chroniclers maintained that they were among the first to consume fallen comrades and enemies alike, and the only ones to do so without hesitation. One chronicler wrote that another siege produced hunger so terribly that the Crusaders were tormented by madness of starvation, and so resorted to consuming the remains of enemies that they had thrown into the swamp weeks before. That must have been the most effed up fishing trip imaginable. Soon enough, the creepy reputation of these particular Crusaders began to spread beyond the walls of Antioch when the Muslim commanders asked the Christian Crusade commanders to rein in the Tafurs, because obviously this crap is out of hand, super creepy, and it's not even about religion anymore. Yeah, no, the Christian Crusaders leaders had to awkwardly admit they couldn't actually control the Tafurs, and it was surely an unnerving realization to finally admit that some of the most fanatical elements under their supposed command were so wild and intense they weren't really under anyone's power but their own. Muslim commanders really could only give a metaphorical deadpan, seriously guys, expression when they heard that And last but not least, it's weaponized bees. Finding this has been one of the single most euphoric things I've ever experienced. Just a 10 out of 10 for comedy and serotonin. So get this, King Richard is recording of having used hives of bees as a catapult launched bombs against the Saracens during the Third Crusade in the 12th century. Naturally, I wanted to find out more about this, so I Google it and I find a webpage that's literally dedicated to bee warfare in ancient history. Guys, there is tons! It's a complete rabbit hole. I've pretty much shown it to everyone I know, and it was like news on par with royal weddings or whatever big stuff there is. Anyways, amongst all the centuries of bee warfare there's been, no joke, during the Crusades there was only one documented case, written in a poem, that King Richard had 13 ships laid with hives of bees, which he later used to defeat Muslim forces during the siege of Acre, a city that's now modern Israel. Apparently, he deployed those many hives and their buzzing occupants to such a great effect that the Saracens holding the city retreated, aka they loaded the B words, pun intended, into an effing catapult and rained down honey-laden horror and death. Don't want to sign a peace treaty? Bees. Want a battle? How about bees instead? You got a king, we got a queen bee. That one was Taylor. Sure, there's a good chance that this is all BS history. It's worth noting that the poem was written about 2 centuries after the events described supposedly happened, but as I said, there are thousands of cases where bees were used as weapons in battle all over the world and through history, and more than once in Jerusalem. So I'm Team B on this one. All the B movie jokes.
Number 10, the war to end all wars. Alright, hear me out. Everyone knows about World War I, but that doesn't mean it wasn't weird. World War I was probably one of the weirdest wars to ever be fought, technologically speaking. To put this into perspective, the first successful flight of airplanes was by the Wright brothers. It had only been done 5 years prior. World War I is also noted for the first use of tanks, chemical weapons, just to name a few party favors. But perhaps the weirdest thing about World War I was the use of old war tactics against new war tech. It was quickly discovered that running directly into machine gun fire is bad for your health. Number 9. Just say no! Honestly, just a classic move. Great Britain, being broke, needed a new revenue stream. In total Pablo Escobar style, the British forced their way into China where they fought a war, and China was forced to cede over Hong Kong and other ports, along with letting Britain come in there and just sell all this delicious opium. It's weird because this is a similar tactic to what you'd see with cartels and gangsters, not a country. If old Ronald Reagan knew what was really happening during the Opium Wars, he'd be rolling around in his grave. Just say no, kids. Number 8, the Pig Wars. This is so weird it could only be real. So here's the rundown. After America had beaten Britain in the Revolutionary War, it was time for Manifest Destiny, expanding westward. The British were doing the same thing. They got to the Pacific West Coast and everything was cool, except for some islands not too far from the mainland. It was heavily debated on who owned these islands. Surely this can be resolved without conflict. Yes, it can be, and don't call me Shirley. Well, it almost turned into another global war, actually. Both Americans and British were living on the island, and when a British-owned pig had gone one step too far and eaten out of an American field, that pig paid the price with his life, causing tensions to escalate to the point where the Navy and high-ranking officers got involved, partially being stoked by an American who, to this day, no one knows the method to his madness, but was honestly just looking for a fight regardless. What a crazy guy. Shot a pig, we're gonna start a war. Number 7, the Anglo-Zanzibar War. Never heard of this one, I bet. And as a comedian, I can appreciate the comedic value of this war. Not that wars are funny, but trust me, you'll see. The Anglo-Zanzibar War was a military conflict fought between the United Kingdom and the Zanzibar Sultanate on the 27th of August, 1896. Good year. What's very unusual about this war is its length. No, not because it's still happening today in a technicality like the Korean War, but rather how quick it ended. The conflict lasted about 40-45 minutes. The British Navy began a cannonade at 9 AM and had destroyed a large amount of the Zanzibar force by 9:45, leaving only one British sailor injured. The leader of Zanzibar made his escape, and the British officially moved in. Brutally moved in as well, actually. It was an occupation, it wasn't good. Number 6. For the Emperor. This one is my personal favorite on the list, as it's a story too crazy to believe, but it is very true. Strap in for this one, folks. What do you call it when the war you were fighting ended 25 years ago, but the enemy still thinks it's on? Yep, that's right. If you don't know, this actually happened, and while not a new war per se, it is technically their own little war. What I'm referring to is the Japanese holdouts of the Second World War. In the Pacific theater of war, Americans adopted a strategy called island hopping, which basically saw Marines clear out dug-in Japanese forces all throughout the many islands of the Pacific. When one was cleared out, they would move on to the next, and so forth and so forth. Except the thick jungles of these islands are good at hiding things, more specifically hiding Japanese soldiers who continued to fight World War II even though it was over years prior. Every few years or so, more soldiers would come out of hiding and surrender, but the most extreme case being Hiro Onoda, who was fighting the war for almost 30 years. From 1944 to 1974. During his time hiding, he raided and unalived local Filipino farmers. Next time you go to the jungle, just be careful. You don't know who's out there. Always watching, Mike Wazowski. I'm always watching. Number 5, World War II. Well, surely after the most destructive conflict in human history, we wouldn't be so keen on another, right? Well, wrong. That could be the point right there, but the unusual event that started World War II was nothing. Just like that episode of Seinfeld. It was a war about nothing, George. I don't know. Well, not true, but let me explain. The factors leading up to World War II were all there. Fascism, communism, imperial expansion, again, revenge, unification. However, honestly, like a bunch of bad parents letting their kids get away with anything, nobody really did anything to stop Mustache Man. They used a policy called appeasement, which basically meant he wants something, he gets it. He wants something, he gets it. Not a great system. Okay, you can have that country, but no more. That's it. We appeased you enough. Oh, okay, you can have that one, but next time no more. That's it for real. Oh, fine, you can have that one too, but now I'm putting my foot down. And after 4 or 5 countries fell to Mustache Man, that's when they finally did something. So really, it was neglect. Number 4, Jenkins Ear. 1731, Britain. They were looking for an excuse to attack Spain. After all, they've got a lot of loot and gold, and come on, that belongs to Britain. It's gonna go in our museum, come on, that makes sense. They had just about run out of hope until Jenkins walked into the room. Sounds like a joke, but it's true. Jenkins was an English sailor who had gotten into a confrontation with Spanish authorities 8 years prior. Sadly for Jenkins, it cost him his ear. They took off his ear, because that's what you do back then. And as soon as the British caught wind of his ear, well, it was on. So yes, they did start a war over a man's missing ear, because it's a good reason to steal gold. Number 3, the War of the Bucket. Modena and Bologna, 2 warring Italian city-states. One sponsored by the big man in the big hat, which is the Pope as they call him I think, and the other was the Holy Roman Emperor. Big power struggle. Who's in charge? I don't know. This was kind of the way it went in ye olde medieval Europe. However, in 1325, it began to get a little spicy, as both Modena and Bologna would make a day out of raiding each other's cities, because even though we're pretty similar, we'll just attack each other, because yeah, sure. However, it got real serious when Bologna's bucket went missing. Oh! It started a war, and the real ironic thing is it might not have been stolen at all and just blamed in confusion of a missing bucket. Modena steals a bucket, we gotta get him. How dare you take my bucket? It's kind of like when your sibling takes your favorite toy. You did what to my action figure? You know what I mean? Number 2, the console war. My generation probably remembers the PS3 versus Xbox 360 war. I'm pretty sure Chris remembers that. He does. See? But the real one was Sega versus Nintendo in the 90s. Well, how did it start? Okay, well, Nintendo was on a huge roll. Super Mario, Metroid, Zelda, you couldn't stop them. That wasn't until the Sega Genesis released with the edgiest blue hedgehog ever to grace your old TVs. Millions of dollars in smear campaigns, Genesis does what Nintendo doesn't. I'm sure you guys all remember that commercial. It was a really powerful commercial. I learned about it in business class, so there you go, look at that. And number 1, the Russo-Japanese War. This one's crazy. How about a war, cause it'll make us look cool, said the advisors to Tsar Nicholas II, worried the Russian Empire didn't look so cool anymore because it's been failing for a while. And in a classic schoolyard tactic, let's find the weakest link and start there. Well, they thought it was Japan, but as it turns out, Japan wasn't that guy, pal. He's not that guy, pal. And they won, very surprising literally everyone. So not only did a massive European power start a conflict with a puny island nation for bragging rights, but they also lost that war to a puny island nation for bragging rights. That's just crazy.